Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hypersonic Missile Debate. I am Rebecca Rose, and I will be hosting the event today. We've got a couple housekeeping items that we would like to cover. So you all are going to do. Your camera is not on. And if you have any issues or you're experiencing any problems, there's going to be a troubleshooting tip sheet in the chat. We also ask that for the best viewing experience that you click view at the top of your screen and select speaker view. We do encourage questions, and to engage, please use the chat box. Also, if we have time permitting, we'll have the speaker answer questions, recap, or provide any closing thoughts after. The facilitators are going to be consolidating the questions, so you may not hear your exact question being asked. Please make sure that your questions are relevant, professional, and related to the subject. Also, if you need to find the chat box, you'll see there's a little icon as noted in the red on the screen there. So if you have questions, just put in there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now that we've got these housekeeping items out of the way, I just want to give a quick overview of our program. We've got introductory remarks by Dr. Jamie Moran. We're going to have a talk about the hypersonic missile debate paper itself. We'll have our first panel, and then we'll have our second panel, and then myself or Sam Wilson will be making the concluding remarks. And now that we've got all these housekeeping items out of the way, I would love to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jamie Moran. So Jamie wears a lot of hats at aerospace. He's a vice president and executive director of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, which provides objective analysis and comprehensive research to ensure well-informed, technically defensible, and forward-looking space policy. Before joining aerospace, Jamie served as director of cost assessment and program evaluation, or CAPE, for the Department of Defense, where he led the organization responsible for analyzing and evaluating the department's plans, programs, and budgets in relation to U.S. defense objectives, threats, estimated costs, and resource constraints. Prior to joining his role at CAPE, Jamie served for 5 years as the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Financial Management and Comptroller. He also served for a year as Acting Undersecretary of the Air Force, where he led the Air Force Space Board and Air Force Council. And not to mention, Jamie tells great dad jokes. Over to you, Jamie, to go ahead and get us started.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. At least 70% of that introduction was true. I'm not sure about the great jokes. It's really good to be here today, and I appreciate all of the interest in this event. It's a tribute to the importance of the topic and to the very distinguished guests that we have here discussing it. Rebecca mentioned that one of my hats is as Executive Director of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and that's the auspice under which we're convening this event. For those of you that might be less familiar with aerospace, we were set up by the United States government to provide its technical advice on space programs over 60 years ago now. And given that role, we don't generally take our own positions, right? We are interested in ensuring the government has the best technical insight. We increasingly recognize that on highly technical issues, including those related to space, that the intersection between the science and technology, the economics, and the policy choices has to be even more seamless and more carefully thought through. That's a function of all the changes going on in society and in the technical spheres and in how government thinks about its role. But what we love to do with our center here is pull together a variety of perspectives where we're not in the advocacy mode, but we're in the mode of helping to crystallize the issues and broker the conversation on the most salient facts. So we're really glad to bring together today a variety of perspectives to, as Rebecca said, to support well-informed, technically defensible, and forward-looking policy. So today we're throwing an event, and it's based on a paper that we published last month on the hypersonic missile debate. In that paper, our lead author, Sam Wilson, put together an intellectual framework for considering that debate. And I think it's a classic example of this effort to crystallize options on the hard problems. as opposed to advocating for any one particular solution. You'll get plenty of that from the individuals that we've invited today, who, as I mentioned, are extraordinarily distinguished. I do want to mention one other paper that Sam and a colleague here at Aerospace, Steve Dunham, authored this last summer, which also is very relevant to this topic. It was designed to deobfuscate, if you will, the changing nature of the missile environment. Definitely discussing the emerging hypersonic, highly maneuverable weapons, but also really characterizing that along a multivariable spectrum of activity rather than as a binary switch or night and day change. You may ask, why aerospace? Why are we engaging on these topics? Well, it turns out space and missile issues have essentially been inextricable since the dawn of the missile age and the dawn of the space age that came shortly thereafter. Pretty much every space launch vehicle ever flown, with only a couple notable exceptions, have their origins in missiles. And the expertise is really mutually reinforcing. Some might say, well, okay, but not every space launch vehicle derives from a missile. And I would just point out that when we're talking about hypersonic glide vehicles, which is our focus today, it's been now more than 4 decades since the United States developed a system that used booster rockets to launch a high technology glider that traveled at hypersonic speeds and could maneuver. That glider was called the Space Shuttle. And the success of that program motivated interest and drove technological development associated with hypersonic travel inside the atmosphere. Today, we've got an enormous amount of attention in the defense community on hypersonic weapons. Some of that, of course, has to do with the progress of weapons programs that China and Russia have been pursuing. Part of that is an increased level of investment by the United States government, which has definitely grown in the last several years, and is now measured in the billions of dollars per year for offensive hypersonic weapons, and a significant amount as well in tracking and defense efforts. But I think a lot of the attention is also due to an ongoing and serious debate in US policy circles about how to harness novel technology, how to harness traditional technology in novel ways, and the linkages between technology and strategic objectives. And that's where we'd really like to focus our conversation today. And I hope that the paper that Sam worked on will really help clarify that debate. And we may be able to hear it made with fine point by some of these distinguished speakers we have today, most of whom are folks I've known for a long time and have encountered as friends. So I appreciate folks' willingness to do this. I do have one slide, and Sarah, could you pull it up, please? And this is to identify and just quickly summarize what we see as 4 leading approaches in the thinking within the US about how to respond to what Russians and Chinese are doing in terms of hypersonic weapons development. So let me begin this event with a quiz, or a poll even. I would like to ask everybody listening in, so which of these 4 approaches most closely resembles your thinking? Is it starting from the right side of the diagram, get ahead, which says that the United States should seek to lead in offensive hypersonic capabilities, use those capabilities to achieve strategic advantages over both Russia and China? Second category is what we're calling shields up. That says the US should focus on new capabilities to track and intercept adversaries' missiles, both conventional and nuclear, and to include missiles of what we used to call strategic nature, targeting the US homeland. The third is what we call draw the line, and that's an approach that focuses in on defenses for critical homeland capabilities, like nuclear command and control, against conventionally armed hypersonics, meaning we want to avoid having catastrophic effects on our strategic deterrent from an adversary's conventional weapons. And we would draw a line between conventional and nuclear hypersonic weapons. And then a final approach we'd identified is avoid the race. So rely on deterrence at the nuclear level to address hypersonic threats, and be very conscious of the risk of ending up in a costly action-reaction cycle between ourselves and our potential adversaries. For all of the classic reasons. So those are the 4 categories, and you have a poll up on your screen to express your views. And we will look forward to hearing how folks come back on that. With that, I'm going to hand things over to our first panelist. Our leader for the first panelist is the author of this hypersonic missile debate paper, and that's Sam Wilson. And then my colleague Tom Mencken from CSBA. And Sam, as I've mentioned, has done a lot of work on missiles, on nuclear command and control, and on international space issues for aerospace. He came to us a few years back from the Government Accountability Office and has been auditing us ever since. It's really painful. Tom, on the other hand, is now leading the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where many years ago I was a visiting fellow. And he also teaches at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, which happens to produce some of our top staff at the CSPS. So Tom is well known for his involvement back in the 2006 QDR and the 2008 National Defense Strategy. So great to have both of you, and I hope all of our audience members, our over 200 audience members joining us today, enjoy today's event. Thanks, and let's look forward to a good discussion.
Okay, we're getting the poll results right now. So we'll ask this question at the end as well and see whether people have changed their views. Thank you, Jamie. And Tom, thanks again. It's an honor to have you with us today. I'm a big fan of your work. I actually recently read your book on technology and the American way of war since World War II. So it's a real pleasure to have you. And I think that book is actually particularly relevant to today's event. So, and Tom, before we begin, I just want to note to the audience again that we will leave a lot of time for Q&A. So please feel free to submit chats in the chat window, submit questions in the chat window. Tom, I want to first ask about historical analogs to this technological debate. As I note in the paper, I think this debate is really difficult to navigate, partly because it's just confusing. You know, I think even the term hypersonic missile is misleading because advocates of the systems think that the speed isn't the most important characteristic, right? It's the combination of trajectory, maneuverability in combination with the speed. But more importantly, I think it's really confusing because the debate, the views on the debate quickly go to extremes. Headlines with hypersonic missiles yields descriptors like blindingly fast, unstoppable, invincible, nuclear nightmare, nuclear menace, but also things like ballyhooed, gimmick, hype, overstated, overrated. Hypersonic weapons have been lauded as this modern day equivalent of the introduction of the longbow in the 100 Years' War, and then dismissed as just an unnecessary weapons gap. And today's panelists reflect that divide. We're going to hear from experts who have very different positions on the technology, including some who have argued that hypersonic weapons will be crucial to future war, that their combination of trajectory, maneuverability, and speed will usher in an era of offense dominance, as one of the panelists has written. We're also going to hear from experts who have said that hypersonic weapons aren't all that fast, aren't all that accurate, aren't all that evasive, that their effect on future war is negligible, and that the weapons themselves are a mirage. So, Tom, where does this this military technological debate rank among previous military technology debates in terms of how extreme the positions are, how divided it is, and just how confusing it all seems?
Sure. Well, first off, Sam, thanks for the invitation. Jamie, thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you. At least this afternoon where I am. I know this morning where a lot of the rest of you are. And congratulations on a really insightful paper and a really useful paper. And I mean that because I think what you've done in terms of kind of trying to categorize the debate, trying to bin the debate is supremely useful. Because I think oftentimes we find ourselves, debating kind of at cross purposes with with different sets of assumptions, and I think it's useful to kind of to make those assumptions clear so we can have a better debate. Look, I think the debate over hypersonic technology, has a lot of the imprint of past debates over emerging technologies, right? And so, as you lay out in your paper, I mean, at the one level, it's a debate about technological feasibility, right? So, how optimistic or how enthusiastic should we be about the technology itself, right? And developing any new technology is inherently uncertain. So I think there's that dimension. And then of course there's, and there's the technology itself. And I think as you point out, there are folks who are technological optimists versus technological pessimists. And look, historically, sometimes the optimists are right and sometimes the pessimists are right, or they can both be right at different times. That's another thing. You can be, pessimism can pay off in the short term. I mean, a system may not work out, may underperform, but then actually may wind up really performing well over time. Or you can have a system that seems to work very well initially, and then kind of is not robust to countermeasures and things like that. So you have the technology, you have attitudes towards technology, and then of course the topic of strategic need, right? And I think you do a nice job of talking about how for different groups, different individuals, hypersonics fit into strategy. And there I would break it apart, in terms of wartime strategy, say war winning or potentially war winning weapons. But then also there's the role of hypersonics in peacetime competition as well, right? And the two are linked, but the two are not identical. So you might assign different values there. And again, that's a recurring debate over military technology. And then also, I guess related in particular to the peacetime dimension of it is the notion of strategic stability or instability, right? And that's been a recurring theme, particularly when it comes to strategic technologies or technologies associated with nuclear weapons, long range strike, space, and so forth. So I think, that this is in many ways it's a familiar debate.
Yeah. I think that's true too. It's new technology, but similar arguments. And I mean, and I think what you said, just to expand on that a little bit, I think, one of the reasons why this ostensibly technology debate is so divided is because it's not just a technological debate, but it's also, to me, a strategic debate.
Yeah.
I think, I think people's views on how they see hypersonics, including investment and deployment, depend in large part on how they see the U.S.-Russia or the U.S.-China relationship. And, going to what you said, I think when you think about some past military debates, I usually think of, the technology optimists, the technology pessimists, the technophiles or the Luddites. I'd be interested in your take, whether that's in play here. for me, I'd say some of the same people whom I interviewed who were skeptical about hypersonic weapons were bullish about the effect of other tech could play in foreign affairs. Like I would say, for example, more and better remote sensing satellites in detecting nuclear activity. The common thread for me wasn't, are folks more sanguine than others about the effect of technology on future war? It was more the common thread was, do we want to be focusing on major conflict against Russia and China to include missile strikes in their mainland, or whether such focus is inherently escalatory? Sarah, would you pull up figure 1 again? I tried to frame this debate in terms of strategic aims, right? So on the right end, the aim is to outcompete, focusing on trying to gain military advantages to defeat Russia and China in a high intensity conflict. And on the left end, dampen the competition, right? Believing those advantages will just invite an action-reaction cycle where everyone is more anxious. And Tom, what was most striking to me, and what was completely unexpected when I started, was the alignment I saw between the strategic and the technological views. So looking at this figure, going from the right to the left, you become not just progressively less interested in strategic competition, but also progressively more skeptical of the technological importance of the missiles, right? Get Ahead sees these capabilities as extremely important. Avoid the Race sees these capabilities as overblown. And then these middle approaches are, less sanguine about the capabilities than Get Ahead, but still believes there's some added capability here that requires something to defend against, right? So thinking about this alignment of technological and strategic views, Get Ahead wants to focus on, 1, high intensity conflict with Russia and China, and 2, sees hypersonics as this game-changing capability. So for them, both the technological and strategic views are saying acquire, deploy. And then Avoid the Race sees the opposite on both accounts, right? Doesn't want to focus on a high intensity conflict with Russia and China, and 2, doesn't see these capabilities as game changing. So for them, both their technological and strategic views are saying don't acquire, don't deploy. So Sarah, would you take off figure 1 now? Thank you, Sarah. So Tom, this connection between the technological and the strategic, how intertwined it seems in this debate, is how similar or singular is this compared to debates around other military widgets?
Yeah, look, I think what you found is is a pretty common phenomenon, and I'll just kind of rephrase it, slightly to make the point, which is technologies that are not deployed are generally not deployed for a combination of technical and political reasons. I mean, small p, political. So meaning they're not deployed either because the technology doesn't really pay off, doesn't really offer much of a benefit, and or a perceived benefit, and or that it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. Doesn't seem to have a lot of political benefits. Doesn't fit with the types of scenarios that that a military is planning. Another dimension of it is even just kind of the organizational culture, right? It doesn't fit the services vision for itself, the services organizational culture. Conversely, the technologies, the systems that have succeeded historically succeed both because the underlying technology works and offers some benefit. Again, we should probably think about benefit as we should think about that benefit pretty broadly, not just in terms of is it war winning or what role would it play in wartime, but what war would it play in strategic competition in peacetime. But those systems that wind up succeeding, and I'll say, putting on a historian's hat, in retrospect, wind up succeeding, succeed both because they offer an advantage and because they fit in with a vision, a strategic vision, and then even the vision of individual military services. You can go back and look at history, and history is littered with all sorts of technologies that were feasible, but I'll just say in the case of the U.S., we didn't pursue, and oftentimes it's because the technology didn't fit in with our vision, either as a country, as a military, as a defense department. So I think those things often go together, and I'll say determining those things, both the technical feasibility and the political utility, both in peacetime and wartime, that's challenging, and that can change over time. Things can look one way, let's say in 2021, they could look very different in 2025 or 2035. And you can go back to the history of whether it's the cruise missiles, probably a great example of that, where it's uses, its utility, its perceived stabilizing or destabilizing effect. Those things have all changed over time and evolved over time.
Yeah. That's great. It's so fun to talk about this with the guy who literally wrote the book on this subject. Okay, so I think this is a good point for another audience polling question. Sarah, would you pull up the technology strategy polling question? Okay, do you think technology or strategy is more important in understanding people's preferences for hypersonic missiles? Getting real-time polling data here, and it's suggesting a lot of people have already bought into the argument. Gonna give it a couple more seconds in case more people answer. All right, we'll end it there. Okay. So yeah, 73% of you right now think strategy is more important, which is great. You've already read the paper. All
right, our work here is done. We can leave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, conference is over. So, Tom, you obviously have spent a lot of years thinking about the dynamic of technology and strategy. How would you recommend someone approach a debate like this, in which it seems as if the strategic views may be embedded in folks' views on hypersonics? If they haven't already picked a side, or even if they have, what questions should they be asking themselves? What questions should they be submitting to the panelists today?
Yeah, so I think one way to think about it is through the lens of technology, right? So it's common, when a new technology comes around, to see it as a game changer. And when a technology, I'll put it this way, kind of is on the cusp of feasibility, it's easy to see it as a game changer. Then that technology becomes real, in a sort of a testing sort of way, in an experimental sort of way, and then it maybe it gets adopted, and then and advanced technologies, when they're adopted, almost always are adopted in a sort of an immature form, right? And then they tend to underperform. They underperform, well, they don't really underperform, but they underperform related to the inflated expectations of those who heralded them as game changers. And then you have kind of this this kind of snapback, where it's like, oh, okay, well, this was a false promise. This technology, there's nothing to it. And then what you see is over time, and then so there's a tendency to kind of dismiss it, to throw it away, to say it's all wasted. And then what you tend to see is over time, the technology kind of proves its worth or doesn't. And so the first thing I would say is people should kind of step back from this a little bit and kind of see where we are in the development of hypersonics. I would say in some ways it's too early to say game changer or nothing. And I would say, just put that starkly, each of those positions is probably likely to be untrue or inaccurate. The real interesting ground lies in between, right? In between those two ends of the spectrum. So I think that's one thing. That's just something that that happens with technology. With that is cost, right? So it costs to do new things, whether it's field new technology or field a new class of warship that has new attributes, or a new aircraft with new attributes. It costs to do something new. Now that cost, if it's in the private sector, if we're buying a new car or a new computer, like a lot of those costs are invisible to us because they've been absorbed elsewhere. If we're the taxpayer and it's the U.S. government that's fielding new class of aircraft carrier, for example, those costs are on display. Again, we should realize that that's just part of the game. That doesn't mean we should necessarily pay those costs, but we shouldn't be surprised repeatedly when every new thing that we do winds up costing more and taking longer than we think, right? Because that's just in the nature of it. So I think that's important. And then along the time dimension, I just think that realizing that new systems adapt over time, not just technologically. They don't just evolve technologically, but also strategic operational adaptation affects them as well. So I mean, I mentioned the cruise missile earlier. Again, I think it's a great example. We first explored the idea of a strategic intercontinental cruise missile in the 1950s. I mean, that was sort of, well, it was either the first or the second best option for delivering nuclear weapons over intercontinental distances. I used to think it was the first option, but I actually think if you go back and look at the history, actually it was actually hypersonics. It was actually a hypersonic boost glide vehicle that was probably the first idea, and that's because that was what the Germans were working on at the end of World War II. But intercontinental cruise missile was up there as that was the safe bet for delivering nuclear weapons over an intercontinental distance. And we put a lot of money into it. Programs like Navajo and so forth. And there were failures. They were failures, really, because of the state of guidance technology in the 1950s. So we went to the ICBM, and well, then things changed, including guidance technology, both inertial navigation systems, then terrain recognition systems, then eventually GPS. And all of a sudden it became possible to have a cruise missile that goes over very long distances and strikes accurately. And now kind of that's part of the landscape, but only after several false starts. And even if we kind of neck down and think about a particular weapon system like the Tomahawk, well, the Tomahawk land attack missile, the conventional Tomahawk land attack missile, that was the third mission of that airframe, right? First was a nuclear strike missile. Then, actually, first was an anti-ship missile, which again proved inaccurate. So there's the Tomahawk anti-ship missile, which proved infeasible because of problems with targeting. Then the nuclear Tomahawk, and then the conventional Tomahawk. It was the third, if you will, the kind of the big. Well, at this point, at least for now, the only use of it was the third mission. Now we're getting back to maritime strike. And now there's, at least the most recent NPR talks about a new nuclear armed submarine launched cruise missile. So I think that's a great, parable for thinking about new technologies and how they can evolve and how they can adapt.
Tom, we're getting some really good questions. I also want to ask you the defense piece in this, but
Yeah.
one thing that you said early that I just wanted to pull on was you mentioned the peacetime benefits versus the wartime benefits, and I was wondering if you could expand on that for this debate, for the glider and scramjet system debate.
Yeah, well, sure. So I think it's maybe it's easiest to see by looking at our competitors, right? So both Russia and China, have developed and displayed in I'd say both sort of ostentatiously, but probably the Russians get an edge on the Chinese in ostentatiousness of their display of their hypersonic systems to influence us, right? Presumably they're requiring them for wartime purposes, for warfighting purposes, but they're also acquiring them to influence us. And whether it's President Putin unveiling new nuclear capabilities in a very public way, or Chinese parades featuring the DF-17 and other publicized events, they're revealing new capabilities in an effort to influence us, to shift our calculations, right, and shift our deterrent calculations, perhaps try to influence our defense investment, and certainly our competitors are doing that. I think at the very least we should realize that our competitors are doing that in an effort to influence us. We should probably be thoughtful about what we reveal and what we choose not to reveal as well. So I think that's a key part of it. I think the arms race metaphor is I don't know. I don't know that it accurately portrayed the Cold War, let alone accurately portraying the situation we're in now. And that could be a whole different conversation. But clearly, our competitors are seeking to influence us, and we're seeking to influence them. So there's some external there's an external dimension to it there. But then, as we've been talking about too, there's a whole bunch of internal dimensions in the United States, and I'm sure there are internal dimensions in Russia and China as well. So I think at the very least we should be cognizant of that fact, and where it's beneficial, I think we should use that. We should use that very consciously as part of our strategy. You're going to talk about hypersonic defense. I think that's a very important topic, something we should take seriously. But maybe we're not the only ones who should have to worry about hypersonic defense. Maybe the Russians and the Chinese should have to worry about it as well. And I said that maybe because I think that's a great topic for discussion and debate. And with that, is the debate over kind of stability and instability, and that's another great dimension of this, right? So back to my cruise missile example, when the cruise missile was introduced, at least in the United States, part of the argument was that it was stabilizing from a strategic standpoint. What we now know about the Soviet calculation is that they were tremendously worried about it. They didn't see it as stabilizing at all. So I think we need to understand, our own, not just our own views of these things, get our own house in order. But we also need to think about how competitors see these and may respond to them as well.
Yeah. I would just point out too, on your note about arms races in the Cold War, one thing that was really interesting to me through this project is that, in the interviews, I wasn't initially asking anyone about Cold War arms races, but I just got these responses, and they fit also sort of in line with how you would imagine, right? Like people who were skeptical of hypersonic weapons were often drawing different lessons from the Cold War than people who were saying, we should be developing several hundred to several thousand of these things, right? Like it was just the interpretations and from the U.S. Soviet past was just very, very different. And to me, it just again reinforced that it's our worldview that is kind of in some ways shaping how we approach these debates, and that's why they're so old debates. It's new capabilities, but old debates. And And so pivoting that, it's a good segue to thinking about defense. Again, this is an old debate, and one thing that I saw, which was probably not surprising, is that there was a huge divide when I talked to folks about hypersonic defense, whether it was for theater or for homeland. There was actually a lot of support. Most everyone I spoke with believed that there should be something in theater, but it depended on what exactly you needed, depended on what you've actually thought of the weapons themselves, right? How hard they are to defend against. But Homeland was perhaps unsurprisingly very divided, and for kind of similar reasons as you've talked about. And so the Homeland missile defense debate is obviously not a new one. Are we just rehashing the same debate here? Has it changed? What's new about it? What's been true for a really long time?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there are there's a lot of continuity to the debate, right? And again, if I reduce it to a technological problem, how do you track and engage a target in the supersonic to hypersonic range, right? So nobody said it yet, but I'll say it, right? ICBMs are hypersonic weapons. They fly in the hypersonic regime, even if they don't maneuver. And so tracking, but particularly intercepting a hypersonic target that doesn't maneuver, that flies a ballistic trajectory, is difficult, right? And hypersonics, maneuvering, shape trajectories, things like that, adds another layer of difficulty to it. So I think it's not surprising that you see, a lot of the same arguments that have been going on in various forms for decades appearing here when it comes to hypersonic defense. I think that's, again, that can help us, right? So these, as you show in your paper, I mean, these are arguments at one level, they're technological arguments, but they're also political arguments. And I think what's been true of missile defense overall is that, on the one hand, yes, it's difficult. It's technologically challenging. On the other hand, really the most sacred duty of any government is to defend its citizens and its territory. And so the idea that we shouldn't be pursuing defense, I think, well, it struck a whole series of presidents with very different political aims as being something that's worthwhile doing. And I think it struck every Secretary of Defense, similarly as an imperative. Now, again, you can get to the question of how much, to what purpose, but I think those are the lines, and having worked for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, having worked for Secretary of Defense Gates, and Gates in particular, when he first came into office as secretary. I mean, it was something. It's a very important thing to be pursuing. Again, it's one of the most central things any government is charged with doing, is the protection of its citizens.
Okay, all right. I have more questions I want to ask, but we're about halfway through, so I want to. And there's been a lot of good messages over the chat. I know the organizers were going to consolidate these questions and send them to me, but I had to change my computer at the last second because I'm a Luddite and I couldn't get my video to work. So sorry, Sarah and everyone else who's messaging me. I'm first going to start with Daniel Porris's question. I think this was the first one that I see. Even if hypersonic technology delivers everything it promises, does it give a comparative advantage in delivery systems that does not already exist with ICBMs? In other words, if we can't stop ICBMs, does it matter if rivals have hypersonic weapons?
Yeah, I guess. Well, so here I think we're facing one of the challenges in the whole debate, which is, when we talk about hypersonic technology, we really are talking. Well, again, you're talking about a technology to fly really fast. And I think it obscures, different launch modes, different range regimes, and different missions. So if you're just talking about at the intercontinental, again, you're talking about boost glide vehicles atop an ICBM. I guess my personal view is that the utility of those systems is limited. And now, but that's not to say that hypersonics, air launched hypersonic weapons couldn't be tremendously useful for defense suppression and for other missions like that. I just don't know. Yeah, I'm not terribly concerned about the destabilizing impact of hypersonic boost glide weapons against the US homeland, because if you're doing that, you're going to engage the US nuclear deterrent. And again, unless you can figure out an application that where you could use them to disarm us. And then if you get to that point, then then I am concerned. But I think, Daniel's question is a good one. Hypersonics wind up being ways to more effectively penetrate defenses. But again, if it's an attack on the U.S. homeland, I think you're going to incur a major response unless you can disarm us, and disarming us would, at least currently, isn't really feasible. Now, there's all sorts of things we could do with the U.S. nuclear force posture to make that much more feasible for adversaries, right? If we got away from ICBMs and just relied on bombers and SLBMs, we would reduce dramatically the number of targets an adversary would have to strike, and it'd be a lot easier to disarm us. But with the current force posture, that's a prospect that doesn't particularly concern me.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, one other element that's confusing about this is what I think is often a mischaracterization of the broader missile environment when people talk about gliders. In almost every even serious pieces about gliders, there's usually a line that says, as opposed to other missiles or conventional missiles or ballistic missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles are traveling hypersonic speed and they're maneuverable. And that creates this false binary of what's maneuverable and what's not. And Jamie mentioned the report that Steve and I had out this summer, and that was based on decades of technical work that Steve's led. But that showed, in fact, that the majority of the missile threat are capabilities, excluding the cruise missile threat, which is obviously maneuverable, but just thinking about outside of cruise missile, the majority of the missile threat are actually maneuverable, right? So we should stop thinking of this as whether it's a purely ballistic flight versus not, because there's very few things that are pure ballistic flight. I mean, even ICBMs, if they have reentry vehicles, are going to have are going to be able to have a powered reentry vehicle that's going to take it to different target sets that you'd be able to predict from early warning, right? So it's not. We should stop oversimplifying, I think, the missile environment, and that happens frequently when we're talking about gliders, just because people are trying to create a frame of reference, and that frame of reference, I think, is often wrong. Yeah. Okay, another question we have. This is from Julia. This may be my chat keeps changing as people writing in. Okay, I'm gonna skip that one because I lost it. This is from Bill. I'll ask Julia's question next. Are Russia and China's developments in hypersonics due to a desire to disable our second strike or to ensure their own second strike?
I think so. Currently, currently, at least what we see publicly about these programs, is that they're currently insufficient to disable our second strike. And again, it's within our power, I would say, to keep it that way. Again, there's all sorts of decisions we could make that would jeopardize our second strike. But we have it within our power to keep that. I think it's to to penetrate our missile defenses and ensure the viability of their strategic forces. Now, but again, that can change over time. I mean, but that's what it looks like for now, right? But again, these things are always evolving. I mean, right now, intercontinental, boost glide vehicles are relatively expensive, and I think they're always going to be relatively larger than just a standard reentry vehicle. So there's different costs associated with them relative to other means of strategic strike. Could that change in the future? I guess it could. I'd be kind of skeptical. I mean, the costs will come down, but I don't think they'll come down so much so to make them competitive with kind of more traditional approaches. Could it change in the future? I guess it could, but yeah, I guess that's what I see.
Yeah. I'm obviously not going to answer this question, but I will just say that I think it's a really good one, Bill. This is another one of those areas where I saw very different responses based on how people viewed hypersonic. So people who were advocating for large numbers often said they're trying to threaten us in new ways. People who are against it were often saying, the reason why they developed these systems in the first place is because we pulled out of the ABM treaty. And so it's again, how you think about the action reaction cycle, how that, in your mind, how that manifests itself. Going back to the point about Cold War and arms competitions or arms races. Okay, here's a question from Julia. In regards to cost, do you think that the concern over government funding being perceived as wasted and the difficulties justifying expenses on projects that can take significant time and investment could contribute to delayed investment in technologies like hypersonics and or backsliding after a series of initial failures? So thinking about some of the political and bureaucratic challenges of systems in which perhaps the first, going back to your earlier example about cruise missiles, when the actual eventual mission is very different from what was initially designed, what it was initially designed for.
Yeah, look, and I personally think that there's a strong case for strong, consistent, R&D funding in emerging areas like this, because if you were to do a study looking at, if you're trying to measure intellectual capital in the United States on hypersonics, for example, and compare it to intellectual capital in Russia and China, and you to track that over time, I think it's fair to say that our pool of intellectual capital is not what it should be, and we let it slide, and we've been paying the cost for letting that slide. I think more generally, there's a tendency, particularly for kind of the outside the cognoscenti, right? You've got this is a wonderful group, and I see a lot of very familiar names, and I see a lot of friends and colleagues having joined us today. But I think there's a sense that probably in Congress, even in parts of DoD and elsewhere, that this is just kind of like it's like a spigot that you just kind of like turn it on and turn it off, when in fact I think what we're really talking about are a finite number of engineers. You're talking about a very finite test infrastructure. You're talking about again, these are quantifiable skills that you really need to have as part of your your industrial base and your scientific and technical base, regardless of what you choose to do, right? So I mean, it's at the very least, you got to understand what the Chinese and Russians and prospectively others are doing. You've got to be able to judge, the threat. You've got to be able to figure out how to respond to that threat. And then beyond that, anything we might want to do on our own. And that just takes a certain pool of intellectual capital. And having asked around different parts of industry, different parts of academia, without getting into the details, we're not as deep there as we should be, just to do those things. And so I think you can talk about waste, but I mean, it seems to me one form of waste is spending on things that you choose not to do. Another form of waste is not paying attention to something and then having to play catch up. My suspicion is that the second type of waste is probably much more wasteful.
Yeah. Interesting. Good. That was good. I'm perusing the chat, Tom. There's a lot of questions about early warning, tracking. I would also use this as my own spin on this question too, of kind of how do you think of enhanced maneuverability of missiles? We talked about how many of the systems that people quote are ballistic are actually not purely ballistic. I have Steve Dunham, I see in the chat, has already clarified that the U.S. does not have any ballistic missiles, in that it operates like a cannon. What does this mean for early warning, for tracking, and how should we think about enhanced maneuverability? I mean, what is a spectrum of maneuverability of the missile environment? Is that, how concerning is that? How destabilizing is that?
Yeah, so I don't know that that attribute in and of itself is destabilizing. I think, I mean, I know, again, and it is kind of a Cold War argument, if you'll forgive me, that precision is destabilizing. And so again, right, you have maneuverability for a couple of reasons, right? Maneuverability to penetrate defenses, maneuverability for targeting, and for precision. I don't know that precision and maneuverability in and of themselves are destabilizing attributes. I think it depends much more on how many of these things do you have relative to the defenses, relative to the target set, relative to what you're seeking to do. So it just seems to me, again, we got to bring strategy back into this, right? That really is a strategic question. And again, and I think if we go back to the Cold War, and not just the case of the cruise missile, but there's a whole series of cases where new technologies were meant to be stabilizing, and either proved to be stabilizing or proved to be perceived as not stabilizing. And that's a tricky one, because in the end, we get a vote, but our competitors also get a vote as to how they perceive these things.
Yeah. Okay, another question we have from Hiroki is, should we still worry about certain combinations, how certain combinations of cyberspace AI in neutralizing hypersonic systems?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we always have to be attentive to the impact of kind of new technologies and how they play. It just seems to me that, and if we think about responding to countering hypersonic weapons, It's likely to be a kind of a combined arms effort. It's likely to be a kind of a multi-domain effort. Look, I always say if it was a technical problem, the technical solution is as easy as it is infeasible, which is, whether you're talking about a ballistic, a purely a ballistic weapon to a boost glide vehicle. Well, the easiest way to destroy it is before it's launched, right? I mean, that's so at least as a technical problem, that's uninteresting, but it's also that's as a solution that's unhelpful, because it's unlikely to obtain, right? So the question is, what are the options, short of that elegant but infeasible option for countering these weapons?
That question triggered a different question in my mind. What future military technology debates are going to most resemble this one? What lessons can we pull? Are just all military, all debates around military widgets going to all look the same from now?
Well, that should be reassuring, I guess, in a way. I mean, tells us we can actually learn from history, which is good. But I mean, I guess at one level, yes, just because, again, as you found in your study, that discussions of technology are intimately bound up with discussions of and perceptions of strategy and strategic utility, and then again also dropping down a level, kind of utility to particular military organizations, right? So that's part of it. Is there a military sponsor? Does this new technology fit in with the way a particular service sees itself? So I think that's, those are, and by the way, understanding the culture of military organizations then becomes a really powerful tool for understanding their preferences and the technologies that they're gonna favor, and then also disfavor. And so the challenge is, well, what if there's some particularly promising technologies, promising in terms of the technology itself, promising strategically, that no service tends to favor? Then that's a big challenge for defense leaders. Is how do you find a foster home for these advanced technologies? So I think those are recurring issues. I think another recurring issue, but for a subset, it gets to these issues, these topics of stability and instability, right? That doesn't touch on all technologies, and maybe it touches on more technologies than it should, right? I mean, again, I think if we go and look back, that stability instability filter is one that we tend to apply, and nothing inherently wrong in doing that, in applying the filter, but I think the ranks of technologies that were genuinely destabilizing are a lot smaller than the ranks of technologies to which the term destabilizing has been applied.
Yeah. And on that, just to pull on that a little bit on the services, big theme in your book is about how the different services incorporate technology and kind of mold it based on their culture and their preferences. All three departments are involved in the hypersonics game right now. Outside of sort of the obvious superficial land, sea, air, how can you imagine if hypersonics investments are going to continue at the rate that we've seen over the last couple of years? How do you think the different services are going to mold their programs to fit their cultures?
Yeah, well, and look, and we can even see it. We can see it transnationally too, right? So look at the way Russia, but yeah, particularly China, seems to be pursuing hypersonics. With a missile-based force, they're kind of going heavily into missile-based applications. That shouldn't surprise us, even if it startles us. But for the U.S., look, I mean, I think the Air Force is really focused on air launched solutions, and that really is core to the Air Force's identity. And what that tells me is probably have a pretty decent degree of buy-in, from the institutional Air Force for hypersonics. I think, for the Army, it's very much, tied to, the redevelopment, of long-range artillery and rocketry. And it's part of a suite of capabilities, right? That meet that need. So you got the hypersonics, you have everything to the strategic long-range gun, and you have a whole bunch of kind of missiles, in between. So there, it's the question is, where do hypersonics fit into that portfolio? For the ICBM force, that's a force that unfortunately has been, somewhat marginal to the institutional Air Force in recent decades, unfortunately. So you kind of, it's bound up with that. And then, for the Navy, of course, there's the sub community, and then discussions, obviously on the surface, for the surface community as well. But there again, it's one of kind of a series of strike capabilities. And again, how does it fit in with a portfolio of capabilities? So I think each of the services will look at hypersonics and seek to bend hypersonics and mold hypersonics to their mission set and their their perceptions of what they're all about as a service.
Yeah, thanks. One last question. I want you to also kind of use it as an opportunity to any closing thoughts or remarks you have, Tom. But we got a question about whether the U.S. should pursue nuclear-armed HGVs or scramjet systems. I saw this argument with some of the folks whose perspectives I would kind of associate in that get ahead category. Obviously Russia has avant-garde, China may be pursuing some nuclear capable systems. What is your thinking about US pursuing conventional systems, or perhaps eventually pursuing nuclear systems?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of benefit to the United States today in pursuing conventional systems, because I look at the I look at the use case. I look at the the strategic operational benefit for the United States, and I see it overwhelmingly in the conventional sphere. So whether it's going after Russian or Chinese defenses, for example, to kind of open up the way for for other forces, whether it's other applications. So for me today, 2021, I think conventional is the name of the game for the United States. Could that change in the future? I guess, for a whole bunch of reasons. But no, I mean, I think the overwhelming case for the United States is conventional. And I think the strongest case for the United States is also, air launched. And so, when, again, it gets back to our our terminology, right? Mm-hmm. So we're pursuing, and then you've got your 2x2, which I think is wonderful, for different, different perspectives. I'll just, by way of, throwing up a final comment, you can have your own, my own 2x2, which is, glide versus, versus scramjet, and then, conventional versus nuclear. I guess I could make it theater versus strategic, and we'd have to wear 3D glasses. It'd be a cube. But I think where we are focused is in one part of that 2x2, or one corner of the cube, and you see the Russians and the Chinese focused in different corners of the cube. Now, again, that may change over time, but I think it's worth clarifying. And again, just to, I'll conclude by commending you again, which is, I think there's power in clarifying a debate, because particularly once you get beyond the cognoscenti, there's just this tendency for the debates to become muddled, and it's not good. I mean, it's not good, because perfectly good solutions can get tarred and tarnished by, by just kind of sloppy thinking. And we can discard things that are quite valuable, or maybe quite valuable, because it just, again, the debate gets muddled. So I'm all in favor of clarity of thinking, laying out your assumptions, interrogating those assumptions. And again, commend you for your paper, and I commend you for this workshop. I'm really looking forward to listening to the remainder of it.
So, Tom, thanks so much. Again, real pleasure having you. So before passing into the next panel, I just want to impress upon the audience, as you hear from the different panelists today, to be thinking about how the strategic views are embedded with folks' views on hypersonic weapons. My argument is that although this debate is often framed as a technological one, it is much more nuanced than that. Hypersonic missiles are shaped by whether we're trying to win an arms competition or avoid an arms competition, whether we should be seeking to pressure Russia and China or reassure Russia and China. Differences in views on hypersonic missiles are shaped by different opinions over what prompted Russia and China to develop these missiles, different interpretations of the Cold War. And I think, collectively, these different takes drive divergent strategic aims that hypersonic missiles can contribute to or undermine. Strategic aims which are heavily intertwined with our technological views. So I will now hand this over to a terrific panel with Dr. Jeffrey Lewis and Rebecca Heinrichs. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and boss, Russell Rumbaugh, who will be moderating. Russell leads much of the defense and budgetary work at the center pertinent to today's event. He wrote a paper, an excellent paper last year on different schools of operational thought for space, one of which was global missile war. And Russell, before turning it over to you, I just want to note to everyone, if you're not one of the panelists, please stop your video. Thanks. Over to you, Russell.
Thanks, Sam, and congratulations on the paper and today's event, although I think you've gotten enough compliments. Tom was gracious enough to come back and compliment you again, so I'm done providing compliments. I do have lots of compliments from my fellow panelists. However, I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. Both of my panelists have been a part of my life for a long time. More importantly, they've been a part of the national dialogue about these kind of weapon systems for just as long. Rebecca Heinrichs and I were staffers together for HASC members way back when. I got to watch her member punch much higher than his weight in committee seniority or committee assignment, which is always a sign that somebody's got a very good staffer behind them. Wasn't surprising to me when she left the HASC to become a public figure herself and has been a key voice in the public dialogue on strategic systems. She continues that role today as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and thank you for being on the panel. This is actually my first time meeting Jeffrey Lewis in person, or whatever we call this virtual interaction. Sure. But dating from the same time period as a relatively young staffer who had to get smart fast on nuclear and strategic issues, it was Jeffrey's site, Arms Control Wonk, I turned to for accessible and rigorous understanding of those. A decade later, the site and Jeffrey continue to explore and explain these issues. He's still at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. So a pleasure to get to meet you finally, Jeffrey, and thanks for all your help you've provided over the years without even knowing it.
It's nice to see you.
Sam has set up a neat event here. I'm not sure everybody realizes this, but you do know Rebecca and Jeffrey aren't likely to agree on a bunch of things. But they both have multi-layered, deep-rooted understanding of why they think what they think. Tom talked about folks outside of the cognoscenti not quite getting all the assumptions and blurring them together. Well, these two people don't blur their assumptions together, right? They know they are all the best attributes of the cognoscenti, people who have thought deeply about the issues. And I think the rest of us are going to learn a ton getting to hear them side by side as they describe all of the thought and research they've done. Of course, we're a government chartered FFRDC, so there's a limit to how exciting our conversation gets. I mean, we're supposed to be a little boring inside, but It'll be exciting. It'll be exciting. I'll ask these two a series of questions to get the dialogue going, and then we'll turn to the chat for some audience Q&A. I'll do my best to try to monitor their chat and still diligently take notes as these two say such smart things. I want to write it down so I can refer to it for later. Start thinking what you want to ask in the chat. You can cheat. We're asynchronous, so you can throw it in there and I'll pull it up later. But start thinking if you want to ask a question as well. To kick us off, Rebecca, can I ask you to give a quick but reasoned opinion? Are hypersonics game-changing, given their technical capabilities?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's a privilege. I also have to compliment Sam's report, and I appreciate his work. And it's nice to see just this objective effort to capture everybody's views and let us wrestle with them. So I commend it, and I'm thankful to be here. To answer your questions, I have been persuaded that that hypersonic weapons it's an evolution in technology that does present very different, qualitatively different considerations for strategy, and therefore it is a game changer. And what makes them a game changer is not one characteristic that's different about them, but it's the combination of characteristics. It's the speed, it's the maneuverability or its ability to evade, and precision. And those three things taken together, especially if you're talking about in the regional context, makes them able to potentially outrun radar, and also makes it very difficult for the United States to keep a track. So we lose track custody for weapons that are headed somewhere towards what the United States deeply values. And we might know when the launch is, we might know right before it hits its target, what it's about to target, but we lose the track custody. And so that makes it very challenging to close the fire control loop and have an intercept or defend any other kind of active defense against this weapon system that is headed towards what the United States deeply values. And so in that regard, yes, especially in particular contexts, and I'll just wrap it up by saying, in the China context, the reason it's so, I think, significant is because you have to understand what the Chinese are trying to do, which is push the United States out of the Indo-Pacific theater, or at least have the ability to coerce and dissuade us from being there, and stresses our ability to make good on our security commitments to our allies. So it's key towards the Chinese objective to replace the United States as the preeminent power and to make good on our commitments in that particular region. And so it's one tool in their toolkit to be able to do that. And clearly they believe it's important, which is why they're investing in it so much. And so the United States has to have a response to that.
Thanks, just what we were looking for. Jeffrey, I suspect you don't quite agree. Can I ask you to give your thoughts on what do the technical capabilities of hypersonics? Uh-oh, we've lost him. Sarah, can I ask you to
there we go.
unmute?
No, that was it was my fault. I went to double check that my microphone was properly set up, and then I muted myself and could not unmute myself. So like Rebecca, I'm really happy to be here. And I do think it's a wonderful paper, and it's such an important debate. You know, I think the challenge is a little bit in the way you frame the question, right? Because you ask, are they a game changer? And okay, I'm one of these people who always objects to the questions I'm asked, which I guess allows me to avoid really answering them. But that phrase is, I think, too often used to elide what we're really talking about. Because, you know, if you say, is it a game changer? Well, like, what game are we playing? Right? And I think one of the central discussions we keep having is, are we talking about are they a game changer in a strategic sense in terms of the delivery of nuclear weapons, or are they a game changer in terms of regional missile capabilities? And I do notice that actually, I think a place we all do seem to agree is, I think we're all more skeptical of these as a nuclear delivery system than perhaps we are as a regional missile capability. But having said that, yeah, I think on the whole, I'm probably more skeptical. And I think the reason for that is, you know, if I say, well, I don't know if they are going to be a game changer, but I know that they, at least to date, have not been. And these are very old conceptual approaches. I'm someone who likes watching old Defense Department documentaries. So, looking at lifting bodies and dinosaur from the 1960s. I mean, there are definitely things that we can do now that we couldn't in the past in terms of material science and electronics. But the idea of a glider, which really is what we're talking about, right? I mean, the missiles themselves, that's already hypersonic. But the idea of a glider is not new. And at least in the past, I think we've never really thought that these are capabilities that are going to change things. We can talk about why I think people are generally pretty skeptical about nuclear delivery at intercontinental ranges, but I guess I'm also skeptical about these in a regional context. And the reason for that is it's unclear to me, and maybe here game changer is useful as a concept, it's unclear to me this will ever be more than a niche capability, in part because there are other ways to defeat defenses. And so if you are looking at, for example, something like Russia's Iskander, which does maneuver, it does fly a depressed trajectory, does present a lot of problems for missile defenses. If we're not counting that as a hypersonic system, then you have to look at, well, we have cruise missiles that can evade. We could imagine aeroballistic missiles like Iskander, and we could imagine gliders. And so, I think at some point you have to sort of sit everything down and ask, well, like, what are the cost of the different capabilities and what are their benefits? And, my closing thought is, when I step back, I feel like we are all very excited about hypersonics as a field. And we're excited, and now we're trying to figure out what they're for. I kind of think it should be the opposite way around, right? We should figure out what our problems are. What is the scale of especially Russian and Chinese defenses we think we need to penetrate, and then talk about cost-effective technological solutions. And if a couple of gliders are helpful, then so be it. I'm not buying any stock.
Well, we're definitely cheating a little bit at that question, although I'm going to cheat and turn that into a pitch. The next panel, if we can be entertaining enough to keep you attached to your screen for another 45 minutes, the next panel is explicitly going to talk about that, strategic versus regional, and defenses versus offense, and in fact, niche versus widespread. So I hope you'll stay tuned. Jeffrey, can I poke at you a little bit? What if I just leave hypersonics out? Can I just ask you, what's your thoughts about the U.S.'s strategic relationship with China and Russia? Can we take up the other side of the equation? How do we best handle these competitors?
Yeah, well, I think this is the funniest aspect of this debate for me, because I actually wish that gliders were good for delivering nuclear weapons. In part because, first, I think it would end our belief that defenses offer us a way out of vulnerability, and also because they're sort of heavier than warheads, which means you'd reduce warhead loadings, which I think would generally be stabilizing. So I actually wish they worked in that particular mission set. But the reason for that, of course, is the answer to your question, right? Which is, I'm somebody who thinks that just a simple fact of the nuclear age is that we live with vulnerability. And we may not like it. It may be unpalatable. But the idea that there is some technological escape from this situation seems pretty unlikely to me. And so I tend to be very skeptical of ideas that we should spend money trying to do this thing, which I think is probably futile and in the end fundamentally dangerous. So yeah, I'm somebody who thinks that the relationship that we're going to have with Russia and China is one of mutual deterrence. That deterrence is going to be centered on vulnerability, and we're going to hate that, but that's the world we live in.
So Jeff, you've drawn that point very sharply, right? It's not just the current relationship with China and Russia, it's the nature of the nuclear age. Rebecca, can I ask you the big strategic question? You were toying with it there in your first answer about specifically with China. What is our relationship with China and Russia, and how do we best manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that in both of them are adversaries. We're still, I think, publicly diplomats still call China a strategic competitor. I saw Secretary of State Blinken, I think, said that we're in a cold peace was the terminology he used today with China. I still think it's more accurate. I can say it, maybe the diplomats can't, that China is an adversary, Russia is an adversary. And China poses the greatest ability due to its economy, its national objectives, and its military investments to pose the greatest threat to the United States and our vital interests. And so that is our primary threat. I think that's driving our national defense strategy. And then Russia is the sort of the junior partner, the junior problem, and also sometimes a convenient partner with some of the things that China is doing to contest the United States. And I think, the assumption that I base my idea about what the United States should do about it is looking at what China says that they're going to do and what they are doing. And they want to be able to attack our carriers, hold our carriers at risk. They want to be able to attack successfully our bases that we have in the Indo-Pacific theater. And that is our force projection. That's what we have there to be able to, again, make good on our security commitments to our allies and partners and maintain what we and our allies and partners have deemed the acceptable rules-based, for lack of a better characterization, I'm always trying to find a better way to characterize it, order in that region. And China is trying to contest that. And so I would actually agree that the hypersonic weapons is just one tool in a larger toolkit for the United States at trying to deter Chinese aggression to upset that order. And I believe that, like the Missile Defense Review, and even was in the Nuclear Posture Review of the last administration, that conventional weapons, along with strategic weapons and along with defensive weapons, all contribute to modern deterrence. And that's why not only do I support the United States investing in defenses against hypersonic weapons, but in the hypersonic weapons are themselves offensive hypersonic weapons. And that we don't just research it, but we deploy them, and we do it quickly, because we're actually trying to change the calculations of the adversary. We want to make sure that they understand that whatever they think they might do to act aggressively upon us or our vital interests would not be successful. And so we cannot merely look at, mutually assured destruction or mutual vulnerability to maintain the kinds of challenges that we have today that is straining the deterrence paradigm that existed since the Cold War.
You got into that regional conversation as well with carrier killers, with basing in the Pacific. If we could just magically freeze the Pacific Ocean, and nobody can cross it either by ship or by walking, and it was just the two homelands, you would still see a need to compete. You would still see China as an adversary and the need to have weapons, and in fact, would see the promise of hypersonics as that problem, even if it was just homeland to homeland.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and again, because I don't, as you see weapons evolution go on, just tale as old as time, you have a certain kind of category of weapons, and then you develop the next category of weapons that are more complicated based on technology development, and you invest in those. That there's no evidence that the United States simply allowing our adversaries to pursue the next cutting edge technological breakthroughs, that the United States should not do that, and that the United States sitting on the sidelines and not doing it would bring about stability. I mean, I'm unabashedly in favor of the United States seeking to defend or maintain whatever we're talking about a particular area, the strategic advantage. And so to the extent that a particular technology or capability will do that for the United States, that I am in favor of doing that.
Rebecca, if I can stay with you for a minute, you got into that dynamic, right? Are the Chinese sprinting as hard as they can, and we just need to run to keep up, or not? Can I ask you more about that, right? When I race my second grader down the driveway, I only run as fast as necessary to make sure he's pushing himself. Can our behavior change what the Chinese do?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to be as realistic as I can without being defeatist. And so I consider I'm a realistic optimist and think that we should always be working to change an environment to make it more conducive to the United States having an advantage. And lots have changed in the last decade in terms of our advantage vis-a-vis China. And so today we're talking about one particular category of tools that we can have in our toolkit, but we could have another panel on all kinds of different things about ships and navies and all the other things that we need to be able to successfully dissuade aggression or win if deterrence breaks down and we do actually engage in a military conflict, and that we do it in a way that doesn't unnecessarily escalate it and on terms most favorable to the United States. And so, you know, your question is a good one, and it's hard to answer, right? I mean, I think that we don't have a whole lot of time. So I'm in favor of moving fast, and I'm also not in favor of simply studying it to death in the hopes of not, quote unquote, you know, wasting money by deploying it. These things are meant to be operationally credible. And then, so I think we need to get them fielded as quickly as possible, because I think right now we are at a disadvantage in this regard, especially absolutely in the regional context.
And Jeffrey, I think that brings us back to you, because when you talk about that vulnerability, you might use the words realistic and pessimistic a little differently about how our actions prompt China.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a complicated thing to answer because, you know, I do believe that there are arms race dynamics, right? So I do believe that our behavior shapes their behavior and their behavior shapes ours. I also believe that we often exaggerate our own role in this regard, and that there are internal dynamics in both countries that have their own kind of momentum. And I mean, the example I always think about with Russia to sort of illustrate that very abstract professorial point I made is, yeah, I think the Russians are motivated by a desire to defeat our defenses. But a simple solution would have been for them to just build more missiles or put more warheads on missiles. It takes a special kind of worldview to say, well, I need a nuclear powered cruise missile and maybe a doomsday torpedo, and maybe I can shoot down some satellites. So there's I think both our behavior, but then I think there is both their own internal behavior. So when I look at this situation, I think particularly with regard to China, you know, the overwhelming motivation is to maintain an ability to deter us. And yeah, maybe I'm a pessimist, right? I think that that's just, they're always going to be able to achieve that, in part because we would have to be very confident that we would really receive very little damage, I think, not to look at even a simple nuclear arsenal. I mean, frankly, I think North Korea deters us. And so China's capable of much, much more than that. So when you ask me kind of, you know, like, well, how do then I approach this whole problem? You know, it's like, well, look, we get to a point where they have a certain amount of deterrence against us. I don't think I have technological options to take that away. And similarly, since I don't think they have technological options to take that away from us, it's not clear to me that we need to spend so much time strengthening our nuclear deterrent because, you know, after a certain point, I think there's really a pretty rough parity. And so, you know, to go back to gliders, yeah, you know, I'm not terribly alarmed at the prospect of Chinese gliders any more than I'm currently already pretty freaking alarmed by the nuclear weapons they have. And I just don't see them fundamentally changing things for us either.
It's always tough with our word choice, right? You're calling yourself a pessimist partly because you're just living with this vulnerability. And I think that's an argument.
I live with jerky neighbors, so, you know, I can live with nuclear vulnerability too.
Rebecca, do you think we have to accept that vulnerability? Is that a fundamental condition of the nuclear age?
No, and I also want to clarify too, that I'm in my opening remarks and everything I've said so far, I've been talking exclusively about conventional hypersonic weapons on the part of the United States, not nuclear hypersonic weapons at all. And so I really do think that they have operational value, just like I think the Chinese are developing to hold at risk our carriers, to hold at risk our bases, all the things that are necessary to project power and also to maintain our alliance structure, make good on our security commitments. Again, all of this is to dissuade aggression, preserve the peace, maintain American interests, and with our allies and partners, most of which I think or allies who are democratic nations who we would prefer that they not be invaded, not have their territory assaulted, and that free trade continues, and people remain free and prosperous relatively as far as people go. And so I'm talking about these conventional weapons as just a new kind of weapon that we can add to our toolkit that can better persuade our adversaries. So, I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about whether or not, to me, what is important, what is more important than whether or not this particular capability is the precise necessary capability to carry out this particular kind or form of destruction in order for us to compel a particular behavior. I am really concerned about what our adversary thinks that weapon might do for them, because deterrence is all about what you can convince credibly of what our adversary will think, and assuring our allies about what it can do. And so I want to be able to develop this new kind of category of weapon, and not even just to have it. Again, I've been a big proponent of being able to test it in some way visibly, so that we can signal and advertise what we're willing to do, what we have, and what we might, I would hope, deploy so that it is operationally viable in the near future. But in terms of defense, just to wrap up here, no, I think that defense is absolutely part of it. And it's not just kinetic intercepting defense, active defense. We can use jammers, spoofers as well, and also passive defenses. All of that, it should be and is part of how Indo-PACOM commander is thinking about what the United States needs to do now that we're trying to rapidly shift to a true solid footing to compete successfully in the Indo-Pacific theater.
Rebecca, if I can push you, do you think there will be a way to distinguish, to convince both ourselves and our adversaries when a missile is conventional and nuclear, or is that just an inherent fuzziness we got to live with, and we got to weigh those pros and cons you're talking about?
I mean, I think I've recognized, and I'm happy to admit that it's uncomfortable. Okay, I think it would be dishonest to say that it's not uncomfortable. I also think we have multiple other weapon systems that have that same kind of ambiguity problem. However, I think the context is going to matter. The political small p context is going to matter, and so it's going to make sense in terms of what the United States would do based on what we value and what is happening in the particular conflict. Should we get there, and I could say more about that. I get a lot of what would make things more stable and clarifying is if the Chinese was more willing to talk and be transparent about their intentions and their capabilities. But I'll set that aside too. But just to say, some of these problems can be made less uncomfortable if we actually had a trustworthy competitor rather than what I view as an adversary who obfuscates and is not transparent in their intentions and capabilities.
A great point, and I want to emphasize, it's because you have looked at it across, right? It's because you've had to come to terms with that uncomfortableness is why you're such a valuable contribution. Jeff, I gotta turn that back to you. Earlier, I made this analogy to me and my second grader. Hey, that's not quite fair, right? My whole job is to raise that second grader and encourage him to work hard. You take if I just run a little bit slower in a relationship with somebody like China, are we just setting ourselves up for losing?
Well, again, right, it depends on what you think the object of the race is. I mean, I think if you believe that simply by stopping all of these programs, the problem will go away, then yeah, you're going to be disappointed, right? Because as I say, while I do think that there is an arms race element to our decisions and their decisions, and we are, I think to some extent, choosing to make this situation more dangerous than it needs to be, there are also internal domestic pressures. And it's not as though if our weapons disappeared tomorrow, I think, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping are not going to cough theirs up. But having said that, you have to ask, what's the point of racing? What's the point of getting to the end of the driveway, right? And again, we do have this problem of we could talk about both conventional capabilities, but we could talk about strategic capabilities. At a strategic deterrence level, to me, there is you can't win the race and escape vulnerability. And so, I'm of the Paul Warnke view that, we're apes on a treadmill and the only victory is to be first off the treadmill. Having said that, there is this more interesting question about what does competition look like at the conventional level? And here, I don't think it's not that same kind of argument. I am worried certainly about the issues of discrimination that you brought up, particularly, on the Chinese side when they have dual capable nuclear and non-nuclear systems, right? So the kind of comfort that I feel with conventional deployments decreases the less that I can, that comfort decreases to the extent that I cannot really separate them. But I just, maybe it's the contrarian in me, but I just find it odd that we're talking about hypersonic systems in this way. But like, we have never built an Iskander-like system, which would offer many of the same advantages, and nobody has conferences on aeroballistic missiles. The Army doesn't seem to be, now finally, I guess they're a little bit interested in moving beyond ATACMS. But I truly wonder if at the end of this we say, well, look, these aren't really good for nuclear delivery. Maybe they have some regional capabilities. That may be true. And maybe they will be a niche capability, but then, boy, it's hard to get study money for such a narrow application, I think.
And to the audience, I'd like to work in more and more of your questions as we head on. So please fill the chat and I'll try to keep track of them. Although, frankly, that was a little self-serving because part of it is Sharon Squassoni has asked a question almost perfect to that last exchange. If both of you had to limit one particular hypersonic capability via arms control, which would it be? I told you it was a good question. See, I told you it was a good question. Now I have to give you time to think about it.
No,
Yeah.
I'll just take a stab at it, just and give you my total honest answer is I'm going to do what Jeffrey, I actually do this too. I reject the question. I reject the question because, I actually see, so people like me kind of get accused. I think it's not an unfair characterization of being against arms control because I see a lot of value in the hard power piece of strategic stability. And, but I think I see them as if people, why doesn't China, I was here, why doesn't China want to talk about arms control? I said, why would they talk about arms control right now? They totally have the advantage in the Indo-Pacific theater. And so it's up to us to create a situation in which they want to talk. We have to create a situation in which it's most conducive to having them talk about limitations on anything or transparency measures, et cetera. And so I think that we can't even talk about limitations on hypersonics until the United States starts. We are started. We have started. And just to clarify too, again, I have been. I'm not ideologically opposed to a nuclear hypersonic. I don't see any purpose right now for the United States to pursue that, nor is the Department of Defense even talking about that seriously. They're talking about heavy investments in the conventional hypersonic delivery system category. And so, I just want to make sure that we're totally clear on what we're even having a disagreement or a conversation about too. But the United States needs to be able to, and just to put a finer point on this too, target those time-sensitive targets or time-sensitive capabilities that our enemy has that would prevent the United States from successfully defending ourselves and retaliating to not just get whooped and pull back and have a Chinese victory. So I'm talking about integrated air defenses, and I'm talking about key nodes, radar nodes, and potentially radars, anti-satellite capabilities, launch facilities, depending on the context. All of these things, again, it's an offensive defense mix. We try to limit the damage of what would happen in an initial strike against the United States or I guess I should say our interests in the region or a carrier or something. And then we want to quickly be able to respond so that we don't just keep getting, pummeled. And so the United States needs to work at changing that dynamic before we can start. Well, I think we should be talking about arms control now. I think diplomacy needs to continue, but I think it would be made all the more effective if you have a credible hard power backbone to that creates an incentive to have successful diplomacy.
Jeffrey, I'll let you answer the original question as I asked it. I had actually already rigged it and left out the second part of the question, which had implementation in it. Rebecca, can I ask the question again? I'll go to Jeffrey first, but to give you time to think, can I ask the question again, except instead of arms control, it's just a magic wand. Is there something about hypersonics that we could just magically go away that would ease that strategic dynamic? Jeffrey, your choice of whether you want to take up the original one.
Well,
Is there one particular capability or the magic wand part?
Well, I have a non-responsive answer because I think my view on this is maybe a little different than one might imagine. Again, I said it at the beginning, but I genuinely think it's true that if you could go to a system where all nuclear armed missiles had one glider on them and the glider worked, right, in the sense that it actually evaded defenses, I actually think that'd be fairly stable. And so it's not clear to me that they're the problem, right? What to me is the problem is we're building defenses and the Russians and the Chinese are building systems to defeat that. And that is a complex enough system that it's not clear to me that situation is stable. So, there are other capabilities that I would rather see limited. And my concern, I'm no fun at parties. I think gliders could conceptually be stabilizing. I just don't think that they work well enough to achieve that. I think they'll probably be easier to shoot down. So, if you ask me, like, well, what would you like? Maybe magic wand. I want the gliders to stay very heavy, so you can't put more than one on a missile. But that's not really the issue for me. Fundamentally, the issue is, I don't think either party can build themselves to superiority. And so what arms control does is it locks in stable force postures. And at least for me, that's ultimately going to be about limiting defenses. And then hoping to, remove some of these other capabilities that I think are really loony, like the nuclear powered cruise missile.
Rebecca, can I come back to you with the magic wand aspect of it? Jeffrey managed to put all of his in there.
I'm efficient.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that I've been persuaded by listening to men and women who have recently had the roles, and it's their mission and their portfolio to look at what is the cutting edge technology that is the most concerning to the United States. Dr. Lewis, Dr. Griffin, what both of them have said is it is this the thing that is vexing them the most is the ability of our enemies, our adversaries, to be able to have open wide shots on our carriers and our key bases that we have. Especially, I'm thinking of Japan in particular, and it's how we lose the track. We lose track custody. So it's this. I don't want missiles to be able to. I don't want our enemy missiles to be able to have such wide evasive capability. And so, if I had a magic wand, I would eliminate all of them that have such maneuvering capability, such that we lose our track custody. Because if we didn't lose our track custody, we wouldn't be, well, I should be careful here because there is ballistic missile applicability here for tracking too. But when you think about the big ticket items that I think we need to be able to track and keep track custody are like, HBTSS, this proliferated space sensor layer. We need that because we currently don't have a space sensor layer, or we don't have a sensor layer that's able to keep the track. And so perhaps with a modern ballistic missile defense technology, we would be able to continue to improve it such that we could continue handling the missiles that stay on ballistic trajectories. Of course, I think it was already made, and Sam has made this point in a previous paper that was very good. Even ballistic missiles aren't neat and nice like a cannon. They've got some challenging things that they do that make interception challenging, though not impossible, but certainly easier than the kinds of threats that the hypersonic glide vehicles, et cetera, that we're talking about today pose to the United States' defenses. So I just eliminate that whole, I eliminate the whole category.
And you, like Jeffrey, have gone very much to this defenses part of the conversation. So maybe it's worth pulling that out a little more, especially as we try to do the action reaction understanding of how this all works. You mentioned the space layer. Salmon mentioned my earlier paper at the start of this, and there's a hope that we're getting to a point where it's not just a missile defense that is optimized along one particular path, but actually can handle the idea of missiles coming from multiple places or moving, as you say. Jeffrey, I guess I'll start with you. Like, even if we start getting those awesome capabilities, you're still skeptical that that's really going to change the underlying calculation of stability.
Yeah, I mean, so, I am not someone who sits, right. I guess the way to say this is, I read Wohlstetter's The Delicate Balance of Deterrence and found it unpersuasive. I think that the balance of, or delicate balance of terror, the balance of terror is pretty rough. If you're the sort of person, if you're Stalin, you're probably pretty hard to deter because you're probably willing to take, a fair number of risks. And my guess is, Stalin doesn't sit down and, do a force exchange calculation. So, when I look at this activity, I guess I'll just give a very general answer. It's that I don't see the ability to add a lot of deterrence with more and more capability. I look at that as a curve that gets flat. And if you look at the world that way, which is how I do, then it's basically all cost at that point. And it doesn't matter whether that cost is the money you're spending or whether that cost is the complexity of the system that creates adverse incentives for an opponent in a crisis. I'm not sure if that was exactly responsive, but I just look at stability, I think, in a way that's fundamentally different.
Well, my main chastising you this time is for somebody who has a relatively creative book title, you better get somebody else's really good book title right?
Yeah,
the
I
balance
know.
of terror. The terror is a really important part of that.
I know.
So,
it's Zoom brain.
So Rebecca, can I come back to you and have you talk about your hopes and dreams for defenses and how that interacts with the hypersonics?
Sure. I don't think that, I get, so proving that deterrence has worked is hard because you're trying to make an argument that the things that we have done has led to relative peace. My argument has been, I think that we have maintained the United States since World War II, relative peace, relative to the world wars, and that peace has been established by some kind of credible deterrence dynamic, but that countries change, dynamics change, threat dynamics change. And so the United States has to have a flexible and adaptive way of thinking about capabilities, strategy, policy to make sure that our approach towards deterrence makes sense for the threats we have today. I think that there's a danger in just thinking that what worked at the height of the Cold War is going to work with multiple, not just multiple nuclear powers, but a couple of nuclear powers with robust nuclear capabilities. And with economies, especially in the case of China, able to really do a lot of damage and investments in their capabilities. And so, I think that the United States must continually be looking at how we are, again, posing a credible threat to our adversaries and credible assurances to our allies and partners so that they don't give up on us and then decide to just get their own nuclear capabilities, and then we inadvertently tempt nuclear proliferation. Which means I do think we can't allow these open, easy pot shots from our adversaries. So you have to have not just a defense, but a credible defense. And I'm talking about both passive and active defenses. I don't think that there's a silver bullet here. I think we need a robust toolkit. And so my dream would be that the United States can put in the calculations of our adversaries that it would not be wise to attempt, whether nuclear or conventional, but an attack against the United States or a vital interest that would lead to something. I think they would miscalculate. They might think that, hey, a low yield, tactical nuclear weapon in this particular context is going to be enough for the United States and our NATO allies or our Quad allies to just do for peace, because we don't want to go, beyond a nuclear, first being on the receiving end of a nuclear attack. I want to be able to convince them that they might not be successful in that initial attack. So you have to have some kind of credible defense. And so in the case of the homeland, I do think we should not prevent ourselves from thinking about investing in technologies to provide some kind of defense against strategic attack against peer competitors in the most realistic sense, which I think would be, if not an overwhelming raid attack, I think that's unrealistic, but again, enough to dissuade them from thinking that a couple of shots against the United States homeland would be to their advantage. And because we're not going to sit there and just receive a raid, we're going to be responding offensively to try to end that attack and de-escalate as quickly as possible. So yes, so I think that defense is part of how we should be thinking about what this will look like. If deterrence breaks down, what it will actually look like. It has to be credible. And to the extent we can increase the credibility, we increase the success of our deterrence. And so defense is just part of that package.
And Rebecca, you make a really good point. Sam and Tom in the first panel continued to revisit these echoes of the Cold War, but to your point, we never actually sorted out what happened in the Cold War. Where the historians argue, strategists argue, we're all still arguing all the time. Which Jeffrey, I want to come back to you. You're skeptical of how effective we can make our own, we the US can make our own defenses, and yet you think our defenses are also prompting adversaries to take action.
Yeah.
Does that create a paradox in how you approach it?
No, because just as I am sitting here gleefully accusing people of exaggerating the effectiveness of hypersonic gliders, I have gleefully accused people of exaggerating the effectiveness of defenses, and I suspect that those exaggerations are sincerely held. People reach different technical conclusions, and I think if you look at particularly the Russians, it's actually less true of the Chinese until recently, although it might be changing. I think the Russians have, what did Linton Brooks once say? He said it's wrong to characterize an entire people as paranoid, but if it weren't, we'd say that about the Russians. I think they sincerely believe that those defenses may someday work. I think they have a variety of other concerns about them. And so, I think you could definitely, it's very easy to imagine a system that you look at and say, this does not give me the confidence to change my behavior. Whatever defense this system provides, it's not going to make me any more willing to risk a nuclear war with Russia or China than I already am, which is not very much. While at the same time, that system gives the other side the impression that you might, or that the other side might just simply have exaggerated ideas about its effectiveness. I mean, to me, it's just fundamentally an empirical question. Whether states overestimate or underestimate things, I don't think it's always in one direction or the other. It's just different groups of people make different decisions. So yeah, how we see our defenses, there's no reason other countries would reach the same technical judgments.
Great. Sam introduced the idea of your assessments of technology is one dynamic, your assessments of strategy is another, and now you want a whole nother epistemological, empirical decision. How do we
As
see
a philosophy
each other?
major, I don't believe any of this stuff you people talk about. Sorry.
This conversation was supposed to be helping everybody else understand the assumptions being made, and we just keep reopening more assumptions. Jeffrey, I guess I want to ask, this is similar to how I've already asked the questions, but I think you've given us this answer, but I'm going to ask you one more time. Hypersonics are cool. They're fast and maneuverable.
They are cool.
Why don't
Yeah.
these technical advantages add up to strategic advantage?
Well, look, sometimes technical advantages do add up to strategic advantages. So let me say that at some level, I'm still a little agnostic. There are the two pieces. There is, do we think these things will make a difference in a regional context, which I think Rebecca's done a good job of making the case for. As I've said, I'm skeptical of it because there are other systems that do kind of similar things, and we don't get excited about those. The earliest use I remember of hypersonic in a context of describing a maneuvering reentry vehicle was for the Pershing 2. And so, I do feel like there's a certain amount of enthusiasm here because these things are cool, more so than there is sitting down and really identifying what unique capability these things have. At the strategic level, and I think Cameron Tracy will probably go through this in great detail, there are all kinds of reasons to think that these things are not necessarily going to make a huge difference. So, when you step back, I go back to your original frame. Is this a game changer? Does it fundamentally change? Does it offer us an escape from the reality of the arms race? No. Do I think that it is going to fundamentally alter conventional balance? I revealed preference would suggest that, other similar capabilities don't inspire the same kind of enthusiasm. So I don't know, maybe I'm just depressing. Maybe I'm just no fun. But it seems to me that it's kind of a neat trick and it is kind of cool. And I'm happy that Swerve from Sandia has come back from the dead. But I suspect we'll be having the same conversation in 10 years.
So Rebecca, can I ask you to lay out the logic chain that gets from the technical advantages to the strategic advantage?
Sure. The thing that this has been, I think, hammered home, I think, effectively over the last few years, and the reason that hypersonic offense and defense keeps, getting put up there in the number 1, number 2 categories for our research and development folks, and is a big concern for our combatant commanders, is that I'll stick with China again. I'm picking on China because they deserve it, so we'll just stick with China. But this is, I just want to reiterate too, because I don't know who else is listening. There's other allies and partners who are obviously considered what the Russians are doing here, and the United States should be, I think, just as committed to making the problem more complicated for the Russians as well, for ally security, especially for NATO security and stability. But sticking with the China context, that the Chinese, which they do, not if they have the ability to hold at risk key vital American interests in the region, and we do not have the ability to defend against them right now. Not saying that the technology cannot exist or that it's out of reach. It's not out of reach. It's that we have to take what we already know from the scientific community, all the things that we've been working on, and we have to be able to put them together to produce and deploy the capabilities to better equip us to be able to both defend against them and have the offensive capability. Again, it's not a mirror imaging issue. This is a United States wants these capabilities for the same reasons that our adversary wants the capabilities in terms of their technical effectiveness. But we want to be able to get at those deeply defended targets that are preventing the United States from being operationally successful in the event that we have a conflict. But the reason that they have strategic implications, even if I'm using that word not nuclear, these are, even if we're talking about China and they're talking about non-nuclear conventional systems, hypersonics in the regional context, they can have strategic implications if they preclude the United States from being able to uphold our security commitments and maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific, which they do right now. If the Chinese can target our carriers and we don't have the ability to defend against them, or our bases that we have in Japan or Guam, for instance, which is I like how Admiral Davidson called in its homeland Guam, and he's got a plan to be able to better defend Guam. We're going to need Guam. It's the hub and the spokes of the region for the United States to continue to have a credible force forward presence. We can either just take our stuff and go home, or we can defend it. and provide an answer to these new categories of weapons that are being kind of brandished. And so as long as, this might get to a clarifying point, I believe that it is a vital American interest to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific and to be able to make good on our security commitments. If you believe in that assumption and you agree with that, then you have to decide, well, how best are we going to defend that? And be able to have some operational capability to respond in the event that we are attacked or our allies are attacked. And so that's why it does have, I think, on the level of strategic implications for the United States. So yes, it is just another kind of weapon in that sense. It is just an evolution of the weapons, but because we don't have an answer to them, it really neutralizes a lot of what the United States currently has fielded to be able to carry out our national defense strategy.
And I've been driving you guys apart. I keep trying to emphasize the stark differences. You guys, as normal and regular people, keep emphasizing, hey, there's no absolutes. We need to talk in more nuance. And in fact, the chat is starting to emphasize, hey, we're ready for more nuance. Can we open that up? Sam's spectrum isn't just two ends, right? He has, even on his outcompete versus dampen competition, he has a softer version, which plays with, it's more focused on the conventional nuclear divide than the regional strategic divide. Is there a way, Jeffrey, to you, you've started toying with ways you would be willing to use hypersonics. And as everybody said, there's a lot more agreement at the regional level about that. Are there ways you can imagine hypersonics being useful at the strategic level if you can limit them to conventional?
Well, no, I at the strategic level, if hypersonic, if gliders, right, which is really what we're talking about at the strategic level, if gliders worked, I think they would be stabilizing because they would be immune to defenses and they would be heavy enough that they would, generally speaking, not in all cases, but generally speaking, you'd have one warhead per missile. So I want them to work in that sense because I think that they would, that would sort of be the end of the system in Alaska. I don't happen to think that that's likely to be true, right? So I think what's actually more likely to happen is that they'll be more visible, they'll be easier to shoot down, and they will justify an actual investment in defense. And so what you'll have is a lot more systems on both sides, a lot more systems that are interactive, right? So we will then have to wonder, like, well, what if we were to attrite the glider force in a first strike? Wouldn't that put the missile defense in a better situation? That would generate instabilities. So, the answer to your question is, if they worked, it would be great. But since they don't work, or at least I don't expect them to be likely to work in that context, then I want to. In that sense, I am that first option of avoid that race, right? Let's not get into the game of them building 1,000 gliders and us putting 1,000 GMD systems out there. Like, I would like to avoid it. That's all.
I tried to give you a chance to come over, but you self-identified right there. Rebecca, on your end of the spectrum.
Oh, yeah, you're not getting any happy, no, we're not going to like sing Kumbaya at the end of this. That would be sad.
Rebecca, on yours, the break point is, or I shouldn't say the break point. A break point is the idea that maybe several people Sam interviewed flagged that they thought it was possible to send, a huge amount of hypersonics, all conventionally armed, at the homeland. And as long as you were really, really egregiously not targeting nuclear deterrence, you could keep a nuclear conventional break, even as you indulged in lots of intercontinental hypersonic missiles. Do you think that's possible? And is it something we should be aiming to do?
I haven't looked at that scenario. That seems like an unlikely scenario, and it seems you're saying that it could be a purely conventional strategic attack against the United States, not going nuclear. Is that our fair characterization?
Well, frankly, you may be answering the question already, right? I think many people would see a difficult balancing point. Sam found people who were willing to talk about it. You don't sound like you're willing to take that up.
No, I think that makes me uncomfortable.
Right.
That makes me uncomfortable. And, you know, I want to put a finer point on something else too. I know people want more nuance. I'm trying to actually express that I actually think that my position is the one that's more nuanced. Is I am in favor of investments in the United States having the ability to successfully win in a conflict should deterrence break down. And I think that that makes deterrence more credible. Okay, I've said that so many times, but I want to make so. In other words, I don't even think that we should only be investing in hypersonic weapons capabilities. In that sense, you know, it's not the silver bullet, like the panacea, we're going to do this and then we're not going to have to worry about these other capabilities. I love tomahawks. I love subsonic, you know, systems, especially now that we're out of INF. We can deploy some ground launch systems that are the right range in order that we already have today, that are not as expensive, and that would help get at some of this. So, and because I really do want to deter war and preserve the peace, I think that we should be working with our allies, and we are, to come up with some plans for getting those systems, the subsonic systems, fielded that can handle some target sets. You know, hypersonic weapons are not going to deal with all the target sets, but they're going to handle it some of them, especially those heavily defended ones that require high speed precision strike. And so I guess for me, I think the real debate is what is the balance of investments, and how much do we place in each of these things at once, so that we are doing, which I think is the goal. The national objective is to deter conflict and maintain, you know, peace. We don't want Taiwan to get attacked. I don't want Japan to be harmed. Vietnam, the Philippines, I mean, you get Australia, you could go on, and Guam in particular. And I think all of those things are being, you know, are at a greater risk than they have been in the past, in part because of the enormous missile arsenal and the kinds of missiles and weapon systems that the adversary has been investing in. And as the threat changes, we need to adapt as well.
Well, as we head to the close here, I'll give both of you a chance to close, unshackled by my heavy moderator's influence here. I already want to thank you. This has been great to lay out how there can be two different views on hypersonics and how tied they are to an assessment of the strategic choice, right? So with that, Jeffrey, can I give you the time for a last word?
Sure. I mean, you know, I think the most important thing, I think, is to just step back and ask ourselves, what is the order in which we are doing this analysis? Are we starting with a particular problem, like an assessment of adversary missile defense capabilities? Are we then competing a variety of different options to defeat that? And then are we then going ahead and costing out those options? And at the end of that, are we saying, we need some number of hypersonic systems? Or is it the opposite, right? Are we stepping back and we're saying, like, these things are cool, and surely they are going to be useful, and maybe a way they can be useful is in this area? Because I think if we're doing that latter one, what we are doing is letting our enthusiasm about what I admit is a really cool technology run us ahead of, I think, the proper strategic analysis that we really need to do.
And Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the reason that we're having this conversation, the reason that the U.S. Department of Defense is investing in these capabilities is because our enemies have found it in their national interest to develop them. So the Chinese are not really notorious for their inefficiencies, and they see a strategic and an operational value in investing in this particular category of weapon systems. And you know, we're in a time of great power competition because the Chinese economy has grown such that they're able to come out and more bombastically, I think, carry out their national objectives, which they've been more quiet about in previous years because they didn't have the military and economic capability to carry through those objectives. And then hypersonic weapons are just a part of that. And the other point I would just make is, you know, both Russia and China have been investing in these systems before the United States started talking about them or were talking about deploying them, making them operational. And also they've been working on defenses as well. So, you know, a lot of times we spend so much time in the United States, academics beating up on ourselves or talking about how much defenses on the US side is provocative. But, you know, one of the reasons we need to have new kind of long range strike capabilities is because our adversaries have been working very diligently to have both passive defenses and active defenses to be able to neutralize our offensive capability. And so they're doing it. And so it's not that the United States has provoked this, they've perceived it as in their interest because their interests are contrary to US interests. And that's tale as old as time. So the United States, as long as we deem these things our interest, we have to have both offensive and defensive capability to defend what we perceive as our own national interests and our vital interests of that.
Well, I want to thank both of you very much. Despite me beating the dead horse a bit, both of you continue to have thoughtful and nuanced things to say, considered thoughts. Very much appreciate you joining us to help flesh out this and maybe illustrate the divides in the debate to the rest of the crowd. From us, we go to a more fulsome panel led by my colleague, our newest member of Center for Space Policy and Strategy, Robin Dickey, who has already established herself as a thought leader in the space environment. And she will in turn introduce her three panelists to try to get at some of that detail and nuance that we have kind of diverged away from.
Thank you, Russell. Can everyone hear me? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming and staying so long. We're rounding the bend into the third hour of the event, and I'm pretty sure it's still Tuesday, so thank you, and congrats to everyone who's stuck around so far. I'm happy to welcome three wonderful panelists to the virtual stage. Our first panelist is Jill Hruby, who is a distinguished fellow at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Before joining NTI, she served as the director of Sandia National Laboratories from July 2015 through May 2017. During her career at Sandia, she led several leadership positions in materials science, weapon components, and microtechnologies. Our next panelist, Dr. Dean Wilkening, recently retired from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where he was a senior staff scientist in the Precision Strike Mission Area, working primarily on hypersonic weapon kill chains. His previous research interests include ballistic missile defense, nuclear strategy, and policy and bioterrorism. He has published over 60 journal articles, book chapters, and monographs on a range of security topics. And finally, we have Dr. Cameron Tracy, who is the Kendall Global Security Fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He studies materials science and engineering with a focus on materials behavior in extreme environments and recent work on computational modeling of missile flight. He recently published a paper in the journal Science and Global Security titled Modeling the Performance of Hypersonic Boost Glide Missiles. So thank you and welcome to all of our panelists. So before we dive into the discussion, I want to situate us relative to Sam's wonderful paper. As we've seen so far in today's event, views on hypersonics tend to be a combination of people's technological views and their strategic aims vis-a-vis Russia and China. To illustrate this, we have a figure from Sam's paper, which you've seen before. Together, technological views and strategic perspectives are crucial for understanding the levels of hypersonic weapon deployment and investment a person might support. So now we have our third poll question to show you. So we'd like to see how you, our audience, falls into the four squares in this figure. As the paper explains, there is a correlation between most observers' technological and strategic views, either in support of or in opposition to pursuing hypersonic missiles. Looking at the figure, I think most people fit into the dark blue boxes. We've heard from Rebecca Heinrichs, whose comments seem to fit in the upper right, and Jeffrey Lewis, whose comments I would probably put in the lower left. But of course, this does not capture everyone. Some people might see Russia and China as the main strategic threat, but think that hypersonic missiles are not that technologically significant, or think that hypersonics are a huge deal, but that competition with Russia and China should not be the #1 focus. So for this panel, we're going to explore different technological and strategic views for hypersonic missiles, untangling the strategic from the technological. So which box do you think you fit in? Let's give it another couple seconds, and then we'll see the results of our poll. Awesome. And once we have our panelists up and running, then we can launch right into it. Off the bat, it seems like we have pretty strong consensus for the upper right, which is the hypersonic missiles are significant and we should focus on major conflict against Russia and China. I happen to know that not all of our panelists share that position, so I'll be really interested to get everyone's thoughts. So it's time to just kind of dive right into the conversation, and we're going to start with Dean Wilkening. So I'm going to ask all of you the same kind of introductory question for this first round. We're going to start in technology and move our way towards strategy. So Dean, what do you think makes hypersonic missiles technologically unique, or not unique, if that's your position as we go
along? It's mostly their maneuver capability, which in part is related to their high speed, their ability to fly at high altitudes. And I would underline one point, what's unique about them when you think of their role in our conventional power projection capability, our conventional strike capability. Today, all of our regional conventional strike capability is subsonic. And so in that sense, they add a significant enhancement to our regional conventional strike capability.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. So to follow up on that, this is a question that's been asked of our earlier panels. Do you think hypersonics technologically are revolutionary or game changers?
Well, I actually avoid a lot of these adjectives. I think there is a lot of hyperbolic commentary on both sides of this debate. So whether they're revolutionary, evolutionary, game changer, whatever, doesn't really interest me. I think they're important. And I will probably talk later about the strategic rationale. They're very important for US regional strategy, especially vis-a-vis China. And that's why I think we should deploy them.
Awesome, thank you. Next, I think we're going to go to Jill, just to get this, again, your initial thoughts on the technological uniqueness or ununiqueness of hypersonic weapons. Jill?
Yeah, I feel much the same way as Dean does about this. I think that their maneuverability combined with their speed, while neither is unique, the combination is unique. And so they do provide, they fill a technological void, or they provide some unique technological capabilities that I think are important. And I agree they're especially important in a regional sense. Do you want me to answer both questions now, or?
Yeah, no, I
Okay.
wanted to get a start with the little points, but to see how it builds into your big picture of what you think the significance is technologically.
Okay, and the other question then I guess was about, are they game changing or revolutionary or evolutionary? My view on this is from a technology perspective, they're fairly evolutionary. And we've worked on them for a long time, not only in the US, but many other countries have worked on them for a long time. And they're just, because of multiple reasons, they're becoming more technologically feasible because of materials and communication technologies and different things. However, from a warfighting perspective, and particularly from a regional warfighting perspective, they could be fairly evolutionary. They do sort of change the game a bit with respect to warfighting more than they are a technological revolution. they could change warfighting a lot. And I think this was true for drones, for example. They changed warfighting more than they sort of revolutionized technology.
Awesome. And that brings us to our third panelist, Cameron Tracy. And Cameron, you've been kind of in the missile world news in the last couple of weeks as a number of articles have come out specifically about a paper that you've written about technological aspects of hypersonic missiles. And I know your position is very different on this issue from Jill and Dean's. So why don't you give your kind of opening pitch on what you think the technological standpoint is on hypersonics?
So I actually wouldn't say that my stance is too different from what Jill and Dean have just presented. I completely agree. There are certain things that hypersonic weapons can do that competing missile technologies could not. And there are certain things that other missile technologies could do that hypersonic weapons could not. I think it's always useful to be a bit skeptical when people are making claims of the revolutionary nature of any new technology, because that does tend to be the way we tend to think about new technologies. It's really important, I think, to look at what the unique capabilities of hypersonic weapons would actually give you in terms of warfighting, what they could accomplish that a competing missile technology could not. And in that comparative sense, I think it's useful not to just compare these to the weapons we currently use in regional conventional strikes. When we're thinking about deploying a new weapon technology, it's useful to compare that not just to what you're already using, but any other new technology you could deploy in that same space. So even in regional space, we don't currently use very fast ballistic missiles, for example. But if we're talking about deploying new weapons, that's something we should look at, and we should compare the performance of these systems, these hypersonic weapons too. And if we look at key performance parameters, speed is something we've already talked about. Hypersonic weapons are going to be slightly slower than a ballistic boost glide system, or excuse me, a hypersonic boost glide system. Ballistic boost glide system fired. Hypersonic boost glide systems are going to be slightly slower than ballistic missiles fired on the same rocket booster. That's true in a strategic intercontinental sense. That's true in a theater regional use case as well. Maneuvering, that's something unique, this mid-course maneuvering to a hypersonic weapon. Of course, the question is, why exactly do you want to do that? And what we've already discussed several times in the previous panels is that what we call ballistic missiles aren't purely ballistic in most cases. They have some maneuvering capability. Maneuverable reentry vehicles are a technology that have existed for quite some time. And finally, defenses. Sure, hypersonic weapons could likely bypass many existing defenses. That said, existing ballistic missile technologies, fast ballistic missiles that could be deployed in a regional scale theater operation sense as well, could bypass many, if not all, existing missile defenses. So it's important to look at what new capabilities and what new ability in a warfighting sense a hypersonic weapon would give you. And I would argue that it's a lot less than it might seem at first glance.
But at a guess off the top of my head, you probably wouldn't say hypersonics are revolutionary as a technology, although they might have significant, pros and cons in different areas.
I would say evolutionary, not revolutionary.
Awesome. And there's one kind of technological angle I want to focus in on a little bit, and that's accuracy. So can you speak a little bit on what you think the strengths and weaknesses and possibilities are with hypersonic missiles when it comes to accuracy, since we've heard a lot on maneuverability and speed so far?
Yeah, ballistic missiles have achieved quite high accuracies, especially with maneuverable reentry vehicles. There were tests of a maneuverable reentry vehicle mounted on the front of a Trident in the mid-2000s, the E2, I think it was enhanced efficiency or enhanced effectiveness test bed, which achieved quite high meter scale accuracies. A hypersonic weapon could likely do that as well. It would, in the terminal phase, be performing much the same way a maneuverable reentry vehicle on a ballistic missile would. So I would say they're both highly accurate weapons. Whether one has a unique advantage over the other, I don't see clear evidence of. And in the hypersonic case, there are some kind of unique challenges. When you're flying through the atmosphere for long periods of time, you'll have substantial degradation of the aeroshell, of the aerodynamic surfaces of your vehicle. Those can possibly be overcome, but that's an added challenge that you have to overcome in the hypersonic case.
Absolutely. And so, Jill, I want to turn to you now for a response to some of this, because I believe you have a specific focus when you come to what the potential uses of hypersonics are. And you've mentioned in theater context, but also you've previously written and discussed how, from a counterterrorism perspective, they could be useful. And of course, accuracy would have to be a huge part of that. So could you kind of talk about that relationship as well?
Look, I think the trend in all missiles, but particularly conventional missiles, is improved precision and accuracy. And without that, they're not very interesting. If you have improved precision, you can do sort of surgical strikes, if you will, and I think that is a part of warfare today, and will continue. That trend will continue. I don't downplay the strategic competition with Russia and China. I think it's very important, and that we're talking about it a lot. I just think we have this tendency in the United States to forget the last war, and the last war, and a war we're still fighting, is a war on terrorism. And the original concept behind conventional prompt global strike, which we no longer have a program called that, and for lots of good reasons, was to be able to act on intelligence on terrorist cells, at least in part. And so that we could, if you will, surgically strike important targets in the war on terror. And I think that's still credible. And I don't think we should forget sort of the last war or the current war while we think about strategic competition from Russia and China in new ways. So I do think that hypersonics without precision make them a lot less interesting. And I would also say it appears to me that because Russia has pursued hypersonics exclusively, well, I mean, they do dual capable everything, but they are really thinking about hypersonics with nuclear warheads, that their ability to do precision is not the same as ours, and their speed to deployment, or at least test deployment, that they have is an indication that they haven't yet worked the precision part, which the programs in the US are working really hard.
Thank you. Yeah, Dean, I know precision strike is a big part of your research and expertise. So what are your thoughts on this conversation?
Well, I agree with what was said earlier. I mean, both ballistic missiles and other forms of hypersonic boost glide and hypersonic cruise can be quite accurate, conventional weapons. They do have some slightly different challenges, but yeah, it's all precision guided munitions. That's the name of the game in the conventional warfare domain, whether it's subsonic systems or you get up to the higher speed systems, supersonic, going up to hypersonic, to include ballistic missiles, by the way. I throw ballistic missiles in the same category as the other hypersonic weapons. So it's all precision guided munitions of various speeds. That's what conventional warfare is all about these days.
Awesome. Well, we've had quite a bit of agreement so far amongst our panelists. So I'm going to try to push and see if I can find some areas where you'll disagree with each other. And I think one angle to maybe look at first is actual deployments in terms of quantitative and qualitative issues on that. So Dean, I know you've written in some of your papers that it's possible to justify in excess of 500 or even inventories of up to 1,000 hypersonic missiles. So would you mind kind of discussing what the logic chain is in those deployment inventory numbers that you see?
Sure. Well, first of all, one of the things, let me start with a general comment. One of the things that troubles me about a lot of these discussions are we end up talking past each other. And so just to set the stage, in my mind, the hypersonic debate is not about nuclear weapons. It's not about strategic nuclear weapons. It's not about adding something to our nuclear inventory. It's not about intercontinental range systems. It's about conventionally armed, precision guided, medium and possibly intermediate range missiles for regional warfare or regional deterrence. I'd also add, it's not about gliders only. I mean, hypersonic cruise missiles may be the most cost-effective hypersonic system in the inventories of the major powers. To take Cameron's point, I mean, it is true that it's not just a comparison against current inventories and the conventional regional inventories. If the discussion is a comparison between ballistic missile options with maneuvering warheads or hypersonic glide, hypersonic cruise missiles, that's an interesting discussion to have. And in my mind, a big piece of it's going to be which are the most cost-effective systems. There are missile defense systems, regional missile defense systems that do present problems for even maneuvering ballistic missiles, you know, S-500 type systems. So you have to be aware of that and make sure you can penetrate those with your conventionally armed ballistic missile. So there may be a mix. There may be some ballistic missile options and hypersonic cruise and hypersonic boost glide in a conventional arsenal. But to go to the point about how much is enough, and here I'll say, I mean, the 500 to a couple thousand could be ballistic missiles or hypersonic cruise or hypersonic boost glide. So I'm going to put them all together. And here I'm going to go back and echo Rebecca's point, because from my perspective, it is the strategic rationale for these things that is important. It's not a technological imperative. That's not why we're deploying these things. And the focus is really on China. They're the moving party in the hypersonic domain. And as Rebecca said, I think they're our main strategic competitor because they have the financial resources and they have the technology to present some very serious military threats to US power projection forces in the Western Pacific. I think that's why they're deploying these things. They would like to replace us in the Western Pacific, as Rebecca said. Specifically, they're targeting our naval forces, our carriers, and our airfields, because US power projection capability in the Western Pacific is largely an air and naval power. It's not land forces. And so that's what they want to do. They want to target Guam, they want to target Okinawa, they want to target our carriers, et cetera. So that is a fairly serious vulnerability. If we cannot project power, as Rebecca said, we have a hard time defending our vital interests, our allies. We have a hard time maintaining freedom of navigation. And if we can't defend our security commitments there, then you have to ask, well, if we effectively pull out of the region, then you have to ask what Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, other countries in the area might do. If I were in the Japanese shoes, I'd start thinking about my own nuclear arsenal to deal with the Chinese. So what should the US do to deal with this vulnerability? You can deploy defenses, point defenses, active and passive defenses, again, like Rebecca said. But in my mind, we should deploy enough forces to deter Chinese hypersonic attacks against our carriers and our airfields and other critical targets in the Western Pacific. It's conventional deterrence we're talking about, not nuclear. And conventional deterrence is a much tougher problem than nuclear deterrence because, for one, conventional deterrence has failed repeatedly throughout history, even when weak states attack stronger ones, conventionally stronger ones, it still fails. So this is a tough problem, but that is the problem I think we're up against. And so how do you determine how many hypersonic weapons? Well, why should we have hypersonic weapons to deter Chinese hypersonic attacks against our power projection forces? Well, for one, I think the Chinese are thinking in terms of rapid strikes to defang our power projection capability. And currently, we don't have much of a response to that. They would like to have high confidence that they can do this rapidly and then sue for peace, and the United States will not then have the wherewithal or the strength really to respond. So in my mind, we ought to have some high-speed strike options so that this high-speed war that the Chinese are going to unleash or might want to unleash is not going to go as neatly planned as they might think. That those strike assets they're using are going to come under attack very rapidly within 10 minutes. And so it's really to sow uncertainty into the Chinese mind that this is going to be a clean fait accompli that they can accomplish to push us out of the Western Pacific. Well, so again, how much is enough? What do we need for that? Well, you have to look at what those Chinese forces are. And that's why in that paper you cited, I think, you can look at the Chinese strike assets, both the hypersonic ones, the DF-21, DF-26 ballistic missiles, DF-17, and some of their air forces, and some of their air defense assets, which are another important piece of their anti-access strategy. And you can just count up the number of targets you might have to hold at risk. And I come up with numbers in the many hundreds, if not several thousand, such targets. And so to me, you need inventories on that size. And by the way, it's going to be an inventory that's much larger than the Chinese one, because the Chinese problem is holding at risk a handful of airfields and naval forces. Whereas if we have to hold their airfields at risk, they've got hundreds of airfields we might have to target where they have some of their strike assets. So unlike the nuclear domain where you think of parity, you just count warheads, in this area for conventional deterrence, you have to look at the military capability you have to hold at risk. And those numbers are quite asymmetric. And so that's why I come up with numbers of many hundreds to several thousand is what we need in the inventory.
So to summarize that, you're saying that, you know, there's a lot of significant targets that you would have to consider in mainland Russia and China in order to enact the level of deterrence from a conventional perspective that you're talking about. And that's why it would require several hundred to several thousand missiles.
Right. I mean, again, I think mostly in terms of China, but Russia is an important case too. But it's just, there is a real asymmetry in terms of the number of sites or targets or assets that need to be held at risk. The Chinese problem is much simpler. It's a small number of carrier task groups and a small number of airfields that are going to be difficult to defend. To go back to one of Rebecca's points, yeah, you're certainly going to attempt defense of some of those critical facilities. And in that area, hypersonic defense may actually work well enough to sow uncertainty into the minds of the adversary. But I don't want the Chinese to think that they have a sanctuary from which to launch these conventionally armed DF-21s or 26s. I want them to worry about the survivability of those assets. And so I would design systems to hold them at risk, which means we better get there fast, which means they better be either ballistic or hypersonic cruise, well, less so cruise, but hypersonic boost glide systems. And the numbers better be in the many hundreds, because that's how many they have.
Well, there's a couple points there on nuclear versus conventional discrimination that I want to circle back to. But first, I want to get numbers from our other panelists. So Cameron, let's head over to you. Are you thousands, hundreds, tens, ones, zeros? What are your thoughts on numbers of hypersonic missiles that you would want to see deployed, and for what purposes?
So I think the first part of that question necessarily has to grow out of the second part. So before saying this is how many should be deployed or even whether they should be deployed in a specific theater, the important question to answer is what the use case is, what you want to accomplish by that deployment. And going back to something Dean said just a minute ago, a big question there when deciding what weapons to develop and how to deploy them is a cost comparison. And so once a specific mission is identified, then I think there's a good basis to say, okay, these are the options: hypersonic boost glide systems, hypersonic cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, maybe with maneuverable reentry vehicles if that's necessary. And for that mission, you can compare which of those can or cannot carry out that role and the costs of doing so in the different cases. I suspect that for many cases in a theater scenario, the ballistic missile option could be substantially cheaper than the hypersonic boost glide, at least. And so I would really like to see a clear strategic use case articulated so that that distinction could be made. In the absence of that, I think it's kind of hard to say this is how many should be deployed. I could see a justification for deployment in a hypothetical conflict in the South China Sea, for example. But then the question becomes, okay, could ballistic missiles deployed in the same manner accomplish those same goals? I think there would be a logic to an argument that certain existing defenses, Chinese IADs, for example, could be overcome by the deployment of fast ballistic missiles. And that could be accomplished much cheaper than the development of hypersonic weapons, which currently don't exist in the US case, and their deployment.
And so are you thinking, and we'll focus in this instance a little more on the use than the system, but purposes for mainland China and Russia, or would you focus more on ships, theater, what's the balance between that when you're thinking of the specific use cases where you would consider that comparison of hypersonics versus other ballistic missiles?
Well, the US is definitely looking at use in theater operations. But I do think it's important to mention here that while we are largely constraining our discussion to theater use of conventionally armed weapons, there are currently probably 2 hypersonic weapons that are actually in deployment, Russia's Avangard and the Chinese DF-21. I think the operational status of that is a little bit questionable, but probably those 2. Of those 2, one of them is an intercontinental nuclear-armed, explicitly nuclear delivery system. So we can, of course, say that the US is interested in one type of system, but it's definitely worth talking about the strategic use cases as well. And something Jeffrey alluded to were the justifications for Russia's development of a quite different type of system than what the US is developing. He attributed it to, in part, Russia's concern that the US might develop a reliable, credible defense against ICBMs. That's a very different use case than what the US is considering this theater use of conventionally armed systems. So of course you would have a much different calculus going into that. Each state developing these weapons seems to have pretty different goals. And that kind of plays into this idea of why it's so hard to make clear-cut arguments about this is how many there should be, this is what they should be developed for, because there is this uncertainty over not just what exactly they do, but why exactly they want them, or each state wants them. And I think it's really important to the extent possible to clear that up before we start talking about, well, this is the strategic rationale, this is what we're going to do with them, and this is how they're going to affect missile warfare in the coming decades.
And real quick, I just saw we had a question from the audience for clarification. Are you saying that we would consider using ICBMs with conventional warheads versus nuclear warheads in the case that you were saying to compare use of ICBMs versus hypersonics?
So in the Prompt Global Strike program, that was essentially what was considered in the early 2000s, the use of long-range ballistic missiles armed with conventional warheads. There are, of course, problems of discrimination. In a regional use case, it would be different, but you can use fast ballistic missiles. We can describe them as long range, but they can be used at shorter ranges for a conventionally armed theater strike if that were desired.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. And again, we'll circle back to escalation and discrimination shortly. But first, Jill, you've been waiting patiently. I would love to hear your thoughts now on deployment. I know you've been quoted in the past on kind of focusing on rather niche uses of hypersonics. And does that, what are those uses that you think of? And then again, how does it correlate to what numbers you would think of for deployment?
Well, I think both Cameron and Dean made really cogent arguments in a couple different scenarios for the number of hypersonic weapons you might need. Let me just put a third position out that if we believe these are either for surgical strike capabilities, as I mentioned earlier, for things like terrorists or particular command targets, you may only need a couple because that's you know, tens because they are niche capabilities. If you're thinking of them as a weapon of choice to deter China or to fight China, then I think you would need larger numbers perhaps. But another way to think about this is you might, for that fight, you might actually want several different kinds of conventional weapons. You might want cruise missiles, you might want hypersonic cruise missiles, you might want ballistic missiles, you might want hypersonic glide vehicles. And in fact, there's some power in that strategy in that it is the most confusing potentially to the adversary, or would certainly require them to think about defenses in a very holistic way. So I think this is back to the point that Jeffrey Lewis made about you kind of have to know your strategy before you pursue a certain technology. I actually think those things go hand in hand, especially at the beginning of technologies. That is, you have to understand the technology before you can evaluate it in your strategy. And it's a pretty iterative and dynamic situation. So I would say, I think we should be developing hypersonic weapons because I don't think we can sit out this entire technology because we have enough things otherwise. I do think we need to be in the game. Whether we need to deploy tens or thousands depends in part on what we determine our strategy and the best application for a hypersonic SAR, or how we'll mix them with the other very credible conventional warfighting capabilities that we have. I guess it's a classic answer, it depends.
Always got to love and it depends, but you know, world is not without nuance.
Robin, can I jump in for a second?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just to Jill and also Cameron's points, in my view, there's no question we're going to have a wide mix of conventional strike capabilities. It's not like conventional hypersonic weapons of whatever flavor you have are going to replace all of our subsonic systems. So yeah, you want a mix for a host of reasons. As for the various use cases, I mean, yeah, Russia appears to be deploying an intercontinental range nuclear system. So what? We just ignore it. I mean, their use case, whatever their rationale for doing that is, has very little to do with what I think our use case is. And our use case has to do with especially what I would call our strategic vulnerability. And when I say strategic, I don't mean nuclear. Our vulnerability in the Western Pacific, our conventional power projection capability and the threats posed to that. And so, quite frankly, I don't know why one can't come up with numbers, because regardless of whether you think it is a ballistic missile option or a hypersonic boost glide or hypersonic cruise, you just look at the number of assets you think you have to hold at risk. So if you think it's defense suppression, going after high-end surface-to-air missiles and whatnot, you know, you can go to various tables. International Institute for Strategic Studies publishes a bunch of these things. See what kind of high-end SAMs they have, and whether you can actually get through those systems with a maneuvering ballistic missile versus one of the other hypersonic systems, and come up with some sense of how many you need. There's certainly scenarios where 10 ought to do the job. But in my mind, the target set that you have to hold at risk, the time-sensitive target set, the ones where you have to get there quickly, is much larger than tens. In fact, much larger than 100 or so. And by the way, the terrorist argument, to me, that's a lesser included case. Since I focus on major power competition these days, especially with China, yeah, definitely hypersonic weapons could be useful for various terrorist target sets. But to me, that's not the main driver anymore.
Well, and judging by all three of your stances, whatever the nuances that kind of the targeting and the deployment, there seems to be agreement amongst the three of you, at least, that from the U.S. perspective, there's not much of a use case for the nuclear, intercontinental hypersonics. Seems to be the impression I'm getting from all three of you. Correct me if I'm wrong. But despite that, as Cameron mentioned and Dean referenced, there already is out there in the world a nuclear warhead that can be paired with the Avangard missile, and so there is an entanglement between the nuclear and the conventional in hypersonics strategically that has to be considered. So I want to dig down a little more on the issue of discrimination, especially when Dean, you're talking about a wide range of targets on mainland China and Russia. And although you are talking about it from conventional hypersonic perspective on our side, what is the response that you would see if we were preparing and using that kind of set from Russia and China? Do you think it's escalatory? How would you mitigate that, either diplomatically or in your posturing and your discussions? So please let's talk about discrimination and nuclear versus conventional.
Is that directed to one of us?
To you, Dean, to start.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so to me, the main challenge is how you shore up conventional deterrence, how you deter, again, I'll focus on China, China's use of maneuvering ballistic missiles or hypersonic weapons against US military assets and allies in the Western Pacific. So it's the challenge of conventional deterrence. And by the way, this doesn't mean we get ahead of the Chinese. I think we have to neutralize China's advantage in hypersonic strike in the Western Pacific. And to do that doesn't mean we're ahead of them or we dominate them, but we have to be able to convince them that their use of hypersonic weapons is not going to lead to the desirable outcome that they want. They're not going to dissuade us from leaving the Western Pacific. So having said that, to me, the biggest challenge, the strategic challenge, again, I don't mean nuclear, I mean in terms of strategy, is if deterrence fails, how do you control escalation? Because these attacks are going to take place very rapidly. So there's less time for careful decision-making. Because of the maneuverability of boost glide and cruise missiles, hypersonic cruise missiles, you may be able to divert to targets that the adversary doesn't know where you're heading to. That's going to make them very anxious. And so they may, out of fear for the worst, they may escalate to a level that in retrospect, both sides wish they hadn't done, maybe including crossing the nuclear threshold. So this is a problem I don't think has been carefully thought through. I don't see any evidence on the Chinese or Russian sides, but let's say the Chinese side. And I don't think the US is really thinking it through very carefully yet. And that is, how do we shore up our conventional deterrent to prevent these things from ever being used against our assets, while at the same time controlling escalation, in particular across the nuclear threshold? And I think it's a tough challenge. I don't have a ready answer to it.
I mean, if you did, we could end the event now and just celebrate that we've solved all of our problems. But no, I appreciate the candor in that.
Well, excuse me, one quick thing. There are a couple of simple things. Dual use systems I don't think are helpful, but so to the extent the Chinese and Russians are putting nuclear warheads and conventional warheads on the same system, that's not very helpful. And to the extent they co-locate nuclear assets at the same site they have conventional missiles, that's not very helpful. So whether it's target ambiguity or warhead ambiguity, those issues are not helpful. The US doesn't really plan to do that. Our systems are conventional. And I could imagine confidence building measures or an arms control regime where you could come in and verify that all of our systems are conventionally armed. I can't imagine that China would ever subscribe to such an inspection regime, but it'd be interesting to pursue that with them. So there are some things that are clearly unhelpful that we might be able to work towards, but that doesn't solve the real fundamental problem. I think escalation in modern conventional warfare is going to be a big problem. And by the way, it's not just hypersonic weapons. It's anti-satellite attacks. It's cyber attacks. It's this whole panoply of modern conventional assets, conventional warfare capabilities that's going to make escalation very difficult to control. And especially with China, because I don't think the United States and China have had enough opportunities to learn each other's red lines. How sensitive are they to cyber attacks that might do something? How sensitive are we to anti-satellite attacks? How sensitive are they to a conventional strike against a DF-21 or 26 site in their homeland? And, you know, we haven't had the strategic learning that we had with Russia over many decades. And we went through some pretty hair-raising incidents with them to learn what their red lines were and vice versa. We haven't had that yet with China. So it's not just the technologies and the multi-domain, it's these two countries that don't have deep appreciation for each other's strategic culture, for lack of a better word.
Certainly. Okay, Cameron, so Dean, of course, has proposed the several hundred to several thousand targets in mainland Russia and China. Do you agree with that target set or that mission, you know, setting aside the missiles themselves for a second?
With the idea that it's wise for the US to hold at risk these targets?
Yes.
I think there's a balance there. So what we were just talking about, this risk of entanglement and inadvertent escalation and so on, that's a very real risk with any kind of missile coming into the Chinese mainland. Not just questions of whether, you know, if you're using a dual use system, whether it could be nuclear armed, for example, but whether you could be targeting from Chinese perspective, command and control nodes, for example. And with hypersonic weapons, with maneuverable ballistic missiles, there is always going to be some uncertainty in where your missile is going. China doesn't have an extensive space-based sensor system, so they're going to be relying on ground-based radars largely. Luckily, in a theater case, those are going to be much more effective even against low-flying hypersonic boost glide systems, for example. So you don't have, to the same extent, the problem you might in the strategic case where ground-based radars are less effective over long distances. But it is a risk, and I think that's an important input into the calculation of the wisdom of this sort of deployment. So I think caution would be wise there. I can see a logic behind this. If you wanted to conventionally deter China, holding at risk is a way to do that. So there could be an argument made there, but a counter argument would be that you're incurring new risk, because if you were to actually use these weapons, and of course for purposes of deterrence, you don't actually want to use them, but if you were forced to, then you would run the risk of that inadvertent escalation. So I think a strong argument could be made there that caution would be beneficial as well.
And Jill, what's the reasoning behind, you know, your focus on kind of these specific, you know, counter-terror strikes? Is it out of concern for escalation with Russia and China, or is it just, you know, this is an area that is perhaps underrepresented in the discussion that you want to bring to light? What are your thoughts on that kind of escalation balance on the larger kind of great power conflict side of things?
Yeah, well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that there are reasons to have hypersonics in the great power competition. I just think we shouldn't lose the other, and I agree with Dean, lesser cases of applications of hypersonics. Let me just sort of pick up a couple of threads also. First, regarding the avant-garde and nuclear hypersonic glide vehicles. I just want to say, with regard to this system, first is that Russia has allowed that it is under the is governed by numbers under New START. So they've made a decision to replace a ballistic missile with a hypersonic boost glide missile in their numbers. And I think this is, you know, important to recognize. Second is, I think because they are pretty paranoid about our missile defenses, that the belief that the avant-garde will confuse our missile defenses actually is stabilizing at some level. That is, their deployment of their systems help them believe in their nuclear deterrent capabilities. So I think the fact that Russia has deployed this system is not something we should be overly concerned with, because they've done it, one, in a responsible way, admitting it falls under a strategic deployed weapon and New START, and two, that at some level it's potentially stabilizing. That doesn't mean we should do anything in return. I think that the U.S. position that we don't need nuclear tipped hypersonic boost glide vehicles is correct. It wouldn't change our strategic calculus at all. But so I just wanted to make that comment. It is true that this has happened, and it's not necessarily anything that we need to respond to, and we might want to think about it in an open-minded way. The other thing that we haven't talked about, and a thread that I wanted to pick up on, is it gets back to the defense against hypersonics. And I don't think, I mean, my personal belief is we don't need a dramatic change in our defensive capabilities because Russia's deployed a nuclear tipped hypersonic missile. We do have to think a little bit about early warning, but there's a lot of pieces of that, and we can come back and talk about that in more detail. But I do think we need to think about regional defenses and defenses for our carrier groups, and regional defenses for other targets that we think are going to be important in a great power competition scenario, in a South China Sea scenario. And, like it or not, I think we're probably going to have to make some investments, or at least do some R&D in the area of, can our defenses be improved against hypersonic regional systems for our high value targets.
Yeah, no, you covered a lot there. Quite the spectrum of issues. At this point, I want to take a quick turn back to Cameron to bring up the piece that Breaking Defense did on your study, because I just wanted to hear, how would you respond to that piece? Offered a number of critiques, but what do you respond to some of kind of the big points that came up in those articles?
I think a big one that is pretty frequently made is that, well, the US is focusing on theater systems, not strategic. The counter argument I would make to that is that it doesn't really change our results or conclusions. If you look at speed, you have the same conclusion. A hypersonic boost glide system is going to be slower than a ballistic missile that could be deployed in a theater use case. If you look at detection, a hypersonic boost glide system, you're still going to see the launch. Our results suggest that detection throughout glide is possible with existing space-based sensors. You could argue that you need, better resolution detection if you want to defend against these. But then again, the argument is that existing defenses don't work well against fast ballistic missiles. So that's not necessarily a new capability that hypersonic weapons, boost glide systems at least, give you. Now, if we are talking about hypersonic cruise missiles, that's more of a straight upgrade over a subsonic cruise missile. Of course, scramjets are a really challenging technology. If hypothetically we assume that were perfected, then it would be a faster subsonic cruise missile. That's more of a straight upgrade. But at least comparing the boost glide system to the ballistic missile case, even in the theater use, I think there is not yet a strong evidence-supported, data-supported argument that hypersonic weapons do a ton that a ballistic missile couldn't, particularly a ballistic missile armed with a maneuverable reentry vehicle.
And to push on that a little, taking it back to discrimination and escalation, We've talked a little bit about, whether you can kind of lean into the idea that hypersonics, except for maybe what Russia might choose to do, we're really focusing on conventional. So what do you think are the escalation and the discrimination concerns if you, lean a lot more into conventional warheads on ICBMs? Since I think the vast, typical perception is that ICBMs are nuclear, and although that's not always been the case programmatically, how do you deal with those kinds of concerns or perspectives if you're looking at conventionally armed ICBMs?
So I think it's important to clarify the terms here. When I'm talking about the use of a fast ballistic missile in a theater case, it doesn't have to be used over intercontinental ranges. It's entirely possible to use a ballistic missile in a theater operation, not fired from the US homeland, fired from that theater. High speeds, high burnout speeds, if you wanted to, for example, bypass defenses that are not effective against warheads, RVs traveling those speeds. So this is why I like to say fast ballistic missile rather than intercontinental, to make sure that it's not the range use I'm talking about here.
Yes, so thank you for clarifying that.
That said, so the use of a hypersonic weapon, if it were capable of delivering a nuclear warhead, regardless of what it's armed with, the faith or confidence that, for example, using as an example, China would have in an incoming missile being conventionally armed would be based entirely on its confidence that the US says this is how we're using and deploying these weapons. Therefore, from the Chinese perspective, we're going to assume this incoming hypersonic glider, for example, is conventionally armed. The US currently doesn't deploy intermediate range or medium range or short range nuclear armed ballistic missiles either. So you could provide the same level of confidence by the statement that, hey, this is why we're deploying these weapons. This is how they're armed. This is their use case. It wouldn't be a difference between those two. In both cases, it would be based on Chinese confidence in or trust in the US statement that this is how these weapons are being deployed.
Excellent, thank you. So now I want to kind of dig a little deeper into everyone's core strategic assumptions and beliefs by moving it one step away from hypersonics and into arms races. This has come up several times. We haven't talked much about Cold War arms races yet in this particular panel, but it came up in earlier portions of the event. So circling back to Dean to start with, what are your thoughts on kind of the relative value of arms race? Are they, always a concerning, unstable challenge? Are there times in which they could be valuable or beneficial from a strategic standpoint? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I think the term arms race is usually used in a nuclear context. It's about competition between nuclear weaponry. And in that context, yeah, some arms races are necessary. The one I point to in a paper I wrote is the competition between what used to be the Strategic Air Command, STRATCOM, our bomber force, and Soviet, then Russian homeland air defenses or strategic air defenses. Russia put an enormous effort into improving its air defenses, and we put an enormous effort into various techniques for making sure our bomber force and then later our air-launched cruise missile force could penetrate those defenses. So that's a classic offense-defense arms race in the nuclear domain. Since I don't think the hypersonic debate is about nuclear weapons, it's about conventional, I tend to prefer the term military competition or conventional military competition, because when you get into the conventional domain, there are competitions all over the place between aircraft and surface-to-air missiles, between armored systems and anti-armor and land warfare, between infantry systems. So there's a tremendous amount of competition in the conventional military domain as one country tries to gain a military advantage over another, and vice versa, the other country tries to prevent that advantage from coming to pass. And so that's just the nature of the business. That's going to happen. And I think the hypersonic weapons issue, especially hypersonic cruise or hypersonic glide vehicles or medium range ballistic missiles, those hypersonic systems, there's going to be an intense competition. In fact, I would almost welcome the competition between US offensive systems and Russian and Chinese advanced integrated air defenses, because that's a competition, I think, that favors the United States to the extent, say, China and Russia are committed to deploying these vast networks of advanced integrated air defense systems. We can basically render them largely obsolete through the deployment of these ballistic systems, hypersonic systems, ballistic, boost glide, or cruise. And that's a competition I think we should welcome.
And that brings to mind a lot of comparison to in the Cold War, a similar kind of competition between U.S. offensive kind of airborne focused systems and Soviet defenses, which the argument at the time, of course, was it's much more expensive and difficult to, have to invest everything you have into defenses, and that therefore the competition, is something that could be beneficial to the U.S. But Jill, I want to now bring in your angle on it. Dean has added the wrinkle. First, how would you define an arms race? And then based on your definition and your nuance within that, are there times when it's strategically viable, or is it consistently, destabilizing or threatening?
Well, no matter how you feel about that, you can't avoid it. So it's I'm a pretty practical person, so arms races happen, and they always have, and they always will. So, but I do think that, one of the interesting things about this arms race is it's happening over these sort of multiple dimensions. And by this, I mean the inclusion of the fast flyers, precision fast flyers, the ability to evade defense, all these kinds of things that are introduced with hypersonic. So I think we should be quite mindful about how this particular arms race can spin in some new dimensions. So as an example, there are lots of people who believe that we need to change our national, not theater, but our national missile defense system because of hypersonics. I am not one of them because we currently don't try to defend against Russian and Chinese ICBMs. We only have a defensive system that would be for small numbers and rogue states. But that aside, there are lots of people saying we need a entirely new space defense layer to see things. We need new strike capabilities to get hypersonics and so forth. Well, so if we develop an entirely new space defense layer, now we've got whole new capabilities in space that can potentially see other things that we haven't seen before. Perhaps we will add things to that defensive layer to purposely see other things. Maybe we can now see preparation for mobile land ICBM launches, which may then change China or North Korea's offensive posture, either their nuclear doctrine to say, well, we no longer think these are safe, so we're going to have a launch on warning posture that we don't have today. Maybe they'll produce more, maybe they'll produce more submarine based. So there's the possibility for an arms race that isn't how many hypersonic weapons you have, but how you respond to the hypersonic, what you perceive as a new hypersonic threat. And so this particular set of things, that was sort of a little bit of a far-fetched scenario, but not completely out of question. So I think we have to think about what technologies are you jumping and what arms race are you creating versus just are our hypersonics better than your hypersonics? And so I just want to caution that this particular arms race, because we're in a sort of a new set, we've got a lot of new technologies happening. We've got satellites being a lot cheaper. We have artificial intelligence. We have cyber. We've got lots of things happening at once, hypersonics being just one of them. That my real concern about arms racing right now is not a hypersonic arms race per se, but it's the arms race when all of these technologies are kind of being developed at the same time. And we need to think through the possible interconnectivity that could be produced and what could be a pretty serious arms race if we're not careful.
All right, well, Cameron, you get the last word on arms races, and then once you're done with that, we'll do our speed round of concluding remarks. So please take it away first on the arms race question.
Yeah, so first of all, arms races are inherently risky. They introduce greater likelihood of conflict, for example. That said, there are different types of arms races. Now, what we're looking on with hypersonic weapons is a race to develop a technology, right? It's not yet about numbers or anything like that. If we look at past examples of those, the nuclear weapon, for example, in World War II, Germany was working on nuclear technologies and largely was unable to progress much, in part because of almost an accident. Their graphite was contaminated with high levels of boron, and it wasn't understood at the time that that was a big problem, but that was a huge obstacle to their production of fissile material for use in a nuclear weapon. History would have probably turned out very differently, the outcome of that war and the subsequent Cold War, if Germany had developed nuclear technologies before the US had, for example. So that's an arms race where the goal in that case, or a technology race, I'll say, was a very high impact technology. But I think there are also cases where arms races occur over what is later discovered to be relatively low impact technology. And so there's a risk there when arms race dynamics, which encourage the pursuit of weapons, come to supersede strategic determinations. And this is something, of course, we've been talking about, the melding of the strategic and technological here. And in a lot of cases, those arms race dynamics can subordinate technical facts. So you can race because an adversary has it, even though a more strict technological assessment would tell you that, hey, the advantages of these weapons aren't quite as dramatic, or the likely impacts aren't quite as dramatic as the arms racing dynamics might suggest. So it's important to ask the question before, should we arms race, of what do these weapons do? And is that a capability or lack of capabilities that we want? Does that change the strategic or tactical situation on the ground? And so I would argue that there are these two types of arms races, and the hypersonic case maybe tends a little bit towards the latter. Arms racing dynamics seem to be playing a greater role than technical determinations at this point.
All right, well, this has been an awesome conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, and now we have just a couple minutes left. So in a minute or less, can I get everyone's closing statement? Let's go with Cameron, and then we'll go to Jill and Dean.
Yeah, just to kind of echo what I was just saying, I think there's a lot of value here to evidence-based arguments, to data, which is something that is missing from a lot of the hypersonic debate so far. So advancing that is something that's going to be immensely helpful to pursuing more rational, both technical and strategic decision-making in this space going forward.
Can argue with more data. Jill, what about you?
Well, I certainly agree with more data and more clarity about the way we talk about hypersonic weapons and the truthfulness in their capabilities and advantages in warfighting. I also do think we need to give some serious thought to arms control and what we can do right now that might help offset this conversation in a meaningful way. And a lot of the a lot of the capabilities that we're talking about were controlled before by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and no longer are. So I think it's important to come back and think about hypersonics in the context of what a new intermediate nuclear forces treaty might look like. And as probably the audience knows, the nuclear forces treaty covered more than nuclear forces. So it's not too early, in my opinion, to give some real policy and academic thought to that, especially in so much as monitoring and verification will be very difficult.
Yeah, in another world, if we had a whole another hour on this conversation, we could have spent it on arms control. But alas, they're starting to wave the virtual hook at me to get off stage. So, Dean, why don't you bring us home with your closing remarks?
All right, thank you. And I should thank the organizers too. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk in this forum. But in terms of closing comments, I'll reiterate what I said earlier. The American hypersonic debate is about conventional weapons, not nuclear. It's about theater range systems, not intercontinental range systems. In my view, the offense, it's going to be tough to shoot these things down. Oh, I should say, by the way, if the argument is medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles are preferred over glide vehicles and hypersonic cruise, that's an interesting debate to have. Obviously, we didn't deploy those systems because of constraints of the INF treaty, but all three of those are different flavors of hypersonic systems. Defense is going to be tough. Terminal defense is probably your best early shot, but defenses don't violate the laws of physics. The biggest challenge for the defense is whether you can do it in a cost-effective way. Without wanting to reiterate all the things Rebecca said, I thought she said it very well. We are in a strategic competition with China. It's the threat they pose to our power projection, our air and naval forces in the Western Pacific. That's the big problem for Indo-PACOM. We need to know how to neutralize that. In my mind, deterrence is going to be one of the big pieces. One of the big policy concerns is how do you control escalation? But having said that China's a strategic competitor does not say that they're benign. And I will close with the somewhat provocative comment that in my mind, China's claim to the South China Sea is probably the most egregious land and maritime grab since Nazi Germany invaded the Sudetenland. And so we should keep that in mind, that I don't view China's activities as benign, and they're now building the military capability to back some of these activities up. So we need to know how to dissuade them from ever launching their hypersonic systems against us.
Well, on that big statement right there at the end, but thank you, Jill, Cameron, Dean, all of you for talking today. I had a great time. It is now time for me to hand it back to the brain behind this entire operation today, Sam Wilson. Sam, thank you so much, and take it away.
Thanks, Robin. I just want to quickly thank everyone for making it today. Thank you to a terrific group of moderators, Robin, Russell, panelists, Tom, Jeffrey, Rebecca, Dean, Jill, Cameron. Thank you all so much. This has been really fun. You can see the link here to the paper, and then we will also post the event. We were recording this, so we'll post the event on our website in due time. Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.